I'm the Dolphin of France. This video is purely for entertainment and does not infringe on copyrights or laws. The rights to the novel and image belong to the original author. We do not claim ownership. Don't like waiting and want to listen to this fanfic in full now? Subscribe to our Patreon, where you'll find the best fanfics. Chapter 776, Napoleon, the model worker. Joy flashed in Jubal's eyes. He didn't expect that the enemy would go around the north side of Vence and deliver it to him. He had been skeptical about Napoleon's orders for some time, but now he was only impressed. Northwest of Cannes, Victor had just gotten up and had not had time to wash up when he heard gunshots coming from the town. The sound was much clearer than before, which meant that the battle was very close to him. He was shocked that the Austrian army had really gone around to the west side of Cannes to attack, as Lieutenant Colonel Buvanaba said. Without waiting for the scout to report, he dropped his toothbrush and shouted to the messenger's tent, "Martineau, blow the horn, assemble the troops. Hurry, our fighter plane is coming." His troops had been in a state of combat readiness, and the soldiers slept with their guns in their arms, so after the assembly horn sounded, it took only more than 20 minutes for the troops to be assembled. Victor rode out and waved to the soldiers, saying, "The Austrians have exposed their backs to us. Now is a good opportunity to win merit. Let's go." In the town of Cannes, the Austrian Grenadiers battalion that suddenly appeared from the side and rear threw the French defenders into a panic. The officer commanding the defense cried out that it was bad and hurriedly led the reserve team to the west to defend against the enemy. But the defense here was too weak. In less than an hour, the temporary fence built outside the town had been completely broken. Chiaretto looked at the hundreds of French soldiers shivering beside the main road outside the town and ordered the Grenadiers battalion to form a column and launch a general attack with the cooperation of the skirmishers. As the drums of the Austrian army sounded, Chiaretto and the staff discussed how to cooperate with General Provera to attack the French army on the east side of the town after entering the town of Cannes, but suddenly felt that the drums were a little wrong. He turned his head and frowned slightly. Why did it seem that there were drums in the north? He suddenly shuddered and shouted to his staff, "There is an enemy attack." In fact, it cannot be blamed on Sabotendorf and Chiaretto's scouts for not being diligent enough. It was really Napoleon's arrangement that was watertight. He had previously asked Victor and others' corps to stay more than 10 kilometers away from the battle site and only started to rush to the preset ambush position after the Austrian army launched an attack. The main reason was that he could accurately judge where the key position for the battle would be. Otherwise, if you let the troops so far away from the battlefield, it would be a gift to the enemy. The Austrian cavalry had diligently advanced more than 6 miles for reconnaissance, but the news reported to Bolu was that there was no sign of any French army nearby. Bolu also used this to formulate a battle plan that he thought was extremely safe. At this time, if someone opened the god's perspective, they could see that the Austrian army that attacked the west side of Cannes town had 2 infantry lines hundreds of meters long behind them, blocking all nearby roads. The Sabotendorf Corps, which was heading for Taulenport by Dieter, was falling into Jubal's arms. Near Levant, 20 kilometers north of Nice, Napoleon was calculating something at his desk, and from time to time he turned his head to the staff officer beside him and said, "The ammunition reserves of the Lion Corps are far from enough. The winter clothes of the Montpellier army are too thin. Can they be called winter clothes? We should really let the Notary Investigation Bureau check their quartermaster. Oh, the ammunition of the Moulin Corps needs to be supplied separately, which is a big trouble. Perhaps you should go back to Paris and discuss with the general staff to transfer some copper caps from the direct corps to them." The staff officer nodded continuously and wrote down quickly in the notebook. He was used to the workaholic commander's approach. The latter almost personally asked whether the soldiers' buttons were intact. Although this can ensure that there are no problems in any details of the Legion, Lieutenant Colonel Buwanaba's management ability is undoubtedly genius level. It will bring new problems. That is, he personally handles the affairs of the whole army, which is very inefficient. After all, a person's energy is limited. Even if he only sleeps 5 hours a day, it is impossible to handle all things in time. More than half an hour later, Napoleon finally signed the documents piled on the table. He rubbed his wrist and said to the attendant, "Please bring my coffee." The battle situation in Vence should be delivered soon. I have to take a rest. Soon, an exquisite oriental-style porcelain cup was placed in front of him, and the rich aroma of coffee filled the entire tent. The attendant picked up the sugar cubes with a clip and put them into the cup. Napoleon smiled and nodded. More. Yes, more. Only when 1/3 of the cup was filled with sugar cubes did the lieutenant colonel pick up the brandy bottle next to him with satisfaction, pour the amber liquor into the coffee cup, and then signal to the attendant with his eyes. The latter used a burning wood stick to ignite the brandy floating on the sugar cubes. Suddenly, the red and blue flames danced, emitting an intoxicating aroma of wine. The coffee cup immediately became a glittering work of art. After the flames weakened, Napoleon blew gently, took a sip comfortably, and squinted his eyes with satisfaction. This was his own way of drinking coffee, and it was also his second favorite enjoyment on the battlefield, only after taking a bath. Well, from this point, it can be seen that he was not a devout Catholic. Speaking of which, he preferred to believe in canons. Just as his coffee cup was about to run out, Major Augereau walked into the tent, placed a letter on his desk, and said in a negotiating tone, "Lieutenant Colonel Buvanaba, Baron Defile has requested reinforcement twice. Perhaps, to be on the safe side, we should send some additional troops to Vence." Napoleon drank the last bit of coffee, nodded with enjoyment, and then looked at Augereau. "Please believe that the defense of Vence is very solid. You know, the main force of the enemy's left wing is all there. I have fought against the Austrian army many times, and am very familiar with their combat effectiveness. Oh, that was their Royal German Corps, which was more powerful than the Hungarian Corps led by Sir Bottendorf. They have no belief in a decisive battle at all, and after a few casualties, they begin to consider retreating. I have already told Lieutenant Colonel Defile that, as long as he controls the consumption of soldiers, it will not be a problem to hold out for more than 10 days. Augereau took a deep breath. But what about after 10 days? Bolu must think that he has a huge advantage in military strength. Oh, his army is indeed larger, so he will never be content to advance slowly. As long as Vence is not broken within a week, he will definitely choose to skip it and attack Taulenport. Of course, this is also because he is worried that we will mobilize more troops to defend the Taulen fortress. In fact, Napoleon also deployed a reserve army of 700 people to the west of Vence. If Defile made a mistake, these troops would fill the gap in Vence. In addition, once an emergency occurs in Vence, hundreds of royal guards from Monaco will rush to assist, because the Grand Duke of Monaco was placed by him in the town of Bayat, not far from Vence. So, he just calculated the troops very carefully, but it was by no means an unwarranted risk. Chapter 777 Genius. As Napoleon was speaking, an officer came in and reported, "Commander, the news just came from Vence that the main force of the Sir Bottendorf Corps left Vence and went around St. Jean." Napoleon cast a smug look at Augereau, as if to say, "Look, everything is going according to my script." Augereau's doubts about the commandability of Napoleon, a young officer, suddenly dissipated. He stood at attention and said, "Obviously, you are right, Lieutenant Colonel Buvanaba. Now, I have to assemble the troops." According to Napoleon's arrangement, once the Austrian army in Vence began to move, they would attack south. Napoleon deployed old-style troops in Vence and Canes, while his most combat-effective Moulin Corps had been waiting in Levant, 20 kilometers away from the main Austrian force. All of this was to avoid being discovered by the Austrian cavalry. Joseph used his understanding of the direction of history, advanced military concepts, and powerful weapons and equipment to lead the French army to victory. Napoleon, on the other hand, used his genius military command ability to defeat the enemy. Therefore, Joseph assigned him the lowest-ranking legions in the French army. It was a waste to give Napoleon the powerful new army, and he could defeat his opponent with these old armies. The 3,000 soldiers of the Rouquaby Legion formed 8 chaotic infantry lines, and they had not approached within 800 steps. It must be the Austrian cavalry that discovered us. Rouquaby even planned to wait until all the Vences passed, before launching an attack from the back of the enemy. We stayed there afterwards, and the young man of the Kibby came down by himself. It was just that Rubali learned from the quality of the soldiers in his hands, so he could only retreat in a linear formation. The column attack required less soldiers, and they must have been well trained, and it was likely that they would fall into chaos before rushing to the enemy. The battle lasted for 2 hours. Rubili successfully cut off the Napoleon Legion from the middle. Sebatenla was not prepared to be attacked by a superior enemy force. Before the loss of the skirmisher battalion, I only had 4,000 soldiers left. And before the merger, Victoire had lost less than 5,000 people. After all, fierce fighting broke out there since early morning, and Caretto's grenadiers and the skirmishers that cooperated with me were quickly defeated by the French army in front of them. Then, Victoire's corps and the garrison of Canes launched a counterattack towards Chabilata on the east side of the town. My first reaction was not to order the staff to investigate the spies in the army, especially the officers. Otherwise, how could the French be so vague about the movements of my troops? Napoleon had lunch in St. Jean, and then continued to march westward leisurely. You are responsible for the defense of the line from Nice to the Catibona Pass. Here, you should retreat less for reconnaissance. You are worried that the French will retreat and raid. I know that there will be a fierce battle in the Toulon fortress, and I must let the soldiers rest as much as possible on the way to recover their strength. I can certainly accept the shock of the sudden appearance of 20,000 French troops, but the timing and location of the French attack made me deeply frightened. As for the direction of Canes, the Austrian general muttered, "Let General Kibialella withdraw." At the same time, the battle in Canes was coming to an end. But even in the face of the rapidly retreating line formation, Napoleon had no time to transform the marching formation into a sparse defensive formation, not to mention that the French cannons on the low ground beside him were still roaring. Pitilly von Dannenfeld followed 10,000 troops to help Kibi, and Carly went to the east to stabilize the supply line. At the same time, Provi personally followed the Moulin Corps and my direct Corsican Corps, a total of 9,000 people, and went straight to the west of Nice at a very slow speed. However, just as my small army walked out of 28 kilometers, 5 small cannons suddenly appeared in front of the slope on the northwest side, and they were learning to pour shells towards me. Provi, who was 8 kilometers northwest of Nice, frowned as he listened to the cavalry's report. The position of these small guns was very bad. They could not cover a small part of Ence's position, and there was a dense forest behind them. If they wanted to attack this place, they had to go around from the west, and then go down a road. General Dannenfeld, you will immediately follow the Ratman Brigade and the two skirmishers to reinforce Kibi. It will definitely stabilize the Belle front, and bring the battle into a steady rhythm. The French troops will definitely not be their opponents. In the eyes of the Austrian army, I don't have a military advantage yet. Napoleon, we are just not fully prepared for the sudden attack of the French army. I looked at Olenlo beside me. In that case, you will have to stay there until tomorrow morning. It will definitely delay the retreat into the position, and it is likely to be discovered by the Austrian cavalry. At the same time, the Austrian army summoned the officers at hand and held a combat meeting. But Vence's fast marching speed put me in an awkward situation. Yes, Marshal. Collie stood at attention. Before the staff officers slowly explained the situation on the rear line, the Austrian army looked at the slightly fat officer behind him. Canes was not originally a coastal supply route, but it was convenient for the troops stationed in Toulon port to receive the logistics supplies of British transport ships. Napoleon looked at his watch, stood up and said to the guards, "Load my luggage on the carriage. We will leave in 1 hour." I looked at the soldiers running around, and at this time I had only one thought in my mind. Where did those French troops come from? Very slowly, the Austrian camp became busy. The Austrian army received 2 requests for reinforcement within an hour, and was stunned. At 2 o'clock in the morning the next day, Napoleon returned to the town of St. Jean with 3,000 remnants. The remaining nearly 5,000 troops were blocked on the west side. Under the continuous bombardment of the French artillery, they were unable to organize an ineffective defensive formation. The mutually supported columns were immediately dispersed by the cavalry, and the French infantry outside the town of Canes took the opportunity to rush out. I'm very vague. The Catibona Pass is not only the supply line of the small army, but also the route of advance. Therefore, the Austrian Marshal allocated me 10,000 soldiers to ensure the danger outside. The fierce artillery bombardment caused chaos in Vence. Napoleon ordered the troops to shrink towards St. Jane, but then, a very unrhythmic military drum sound came from the north. Yes, sir. Vince was still organizing the column to attack the French army in the town. Suddenly, Victor led two cavalry squadrons to rush out from the north side of the town and hit the left wing of Sabatella. At the moment, it is not acceptable to give up temporarily. Yes, that is the artillery position selected by the emperor himself, which is definitely a feng shui treasure land for artillery. According to my estimation, I should encounter Kibi's troops reinforcing Bel this morning, or Kibi Lesheofu's corps withdrawing from Bel. The Austrians are too fast. Vents, far away from Bel, moved eastward, trying to join the reinforcement. The Austrian army looked at Kali, the commander of the Sardinian Corps. Chapter 778 The easiest battle. Beside the bushes, French soldiers leaned against their carriages and sang glory and victory accompanied by various portable instruments. Loyalty will never waver. Present victory to His Majesty the King. Use blood and fire to win supreme honor well, although they are not from the Royal Legion, who doesn't have a dream of joining a direct legion. As long as the military song of the guards is sung a few more times, they will find some of the feeling of the guards. Napoleon waved his hand to drive away mosquitoes, and in the background of this song, he was writing a letter in beautiful Roman script. My dearest Desiree, although I'm about to face tens of thousands of Austrian bandits on the battlefield, at this moment my heart is only thinking of you. God is my witness, whether I'm on the march or holding a combat meeting, your beautiful eyes like gems and your gentle smile will always appear in my mind. My love for you is so deep and blazing, it is like a galloping wild horse, carrying my soul to your side. May our love be like a flame that never goes out, burning with our passion and longing. Well, on this way to Toulon, Napoleon met the younger sister of his brother's fiancé, Miss Desiree Eugenie. Then, the two quickly fell in love. Desiree's father was a wealthy businessman with a good family background, which could provide a lot of help to Napoleon's career. But in history, when the two began to talk about marriage, Napoleon met his lifelong fate Josephine. Then, he did not hesitate to dump Miss Daisy and threw himself into the arms of the noble widow. In this relaxed atmosphere, the main force of the Italian front waited by the bush for half a day until the next morning, when the Rangers reported that the Austrian Dannenfeld Corps appeared 9 kilometers to the south, which ended Napoleon's boredom. Only the mosquitoes near Nice spent a night of carnival. As an old-style unit that had been trained at the Paris Police Academy and the first to follow His Royal Highness the Crown Prince in battle, the Moulin Corps has always taken the original Guard Corps as an example. Their ranks are obviously much neater than other old armies, even better than the Corsican Corps trained by Napoleon himself, and they are also the only old army equipped with percussion cap guns, with very strong combat effectiveness. Only an hour later, they appeared on the north side of the Dannenfeld Corps through a forced march. Commander, the nearest enemy is 3 kilometers away. There are about 6,000 people, and there should be 2 or 3 regiments further west. Napoleon nodded to the ranger who delivered the message, and then recalled the nearby terrain. He had personally surveyed the entire southeast of Toulon, and drew a map himself, so he knew this area very well. He quickly pointed to the southwest, and said to Marmont, the hills 3 kilometers away are the best shooting positions. You should set up artillery positions immediately. The 7th Battalion of the 2nd Corsican Infantry Regiment will cover you. Yes, Commander. Napoleon looked at Augereau again. You command the 3rd Infantry Regiment and 2 cavalry companies to avoid fighting with the enemy and move south as quickly as possible to block the reinforcement that may come from Cairns. Yes, Commander. The Serraria Corps is responsible for the frontal attack. Captain Junot commands the Skirmisher Battalion to attack the enemy's right wing. If the enemy shows signs of retreating to Nice, you must block them for at least 3 hours. The 3rd, 4th, and 6th Cavalry Companies will launch a surprise attack from the west after the enemy's formation loosens. The Menil Corps will serve as a reserve. This was originally a surprise attack, and Napoleon arranged it very accurately and meticulously. Basically, any officer who came and did it according to the instructions would not lose. And Joseph assigned him all the talents that were outstanding in history. For Dannenfeld, this was a nightmare. When his cavalry discovered the Serraria Corps approaching the Austrian army, the two sides were only 1.5 kilometers apart. Dannenfeld was completely confused. What was going on? Where did these thousands of French troops come from? If he knew that Napoleon thought he was walking too slowly and took the time to write a letter to his mother and girlfriend, he would probably vomit blood on the spot. The Austrian army began to organize defense in a panic, but was soon bombarded by the French army. Marmont's artillery command ability was second only to Napoleon in the whole of France. 4 12-pound guns and 7 6-pound guns exerted extremely fierce firepower in his hands. In addition, the location of the artillery position was certified by Napoleon himself, which could cover more than half of the Austrian left wing, and the angle of incidence was oblique, so that the Austrian soldiers had to pay attention to the shells flying from the left. Before Serraria started the attack, Dannenfeld's defense line had been bombarded and retreated continuously. This battle was simply impossible to fight. Immediately, more than a dozen French infantry columns launched a charge against the Austrian army. More than 4,000 soldiers quickly deployed in a horizontal column in front of the Austrian army, and then there were flashes of fire, and the percussion guns began to fire dense volleys. Dannenfeld looked at the rapidly collapsing battle situation, stamping his feet anxiously, but he could not make an effective response at all. Soon, the French cavalry appeared on the left wing of the Austrian army at an extremely timely moment. Before noon, the battle was declared over. Because the French army moved too fast, Dannenfeld did not even have time to retreat, and the main force of nearly 5,000 people was surrounded. Under the torture of the artillery, the Austrian soldiers began to kneel down and surrender. Even Dannenfeld himself was captured alive by the French cavalry, after escaping less than 3 kilometers to the west. Augereau successfully found a gap between the center and left wing of the Austrian army and penetrated to the south of the enemy, but before he could launch a siege, his own cavalry took over his job and blocked the enemy's retreat to the south. Augereau briefly analyzed the situation and continued to march southwest to see if there was any chance in Cannes. However, when he arrived 5 kilometers west of Nice, he encountered an Austrian army of more than 3,000 people. Augereau saw the flag of the Austrian army in the telescope and immediately determined that it was the Provera Corps in the direction of Cannes. He hesitated for a moment. He only had 1,800 soldiers, and it was an encounter. If he was not careful, he might be overwhelmed by the enemy. But he soon noticed that the Austrian army's formation was messy and the flag was crooked, which looked very embarrassing. Augereau immediately drew his sword, pointed at the enemy, and shouted to the soldiers, "Victor's corps is behind the enemy. As long as we rush up, we can form a pincer attack." The morale of the French soldiers was immediately high, and they rushed up with him, howling. In fact, Victor was still busy clearing the enemies around Cannes, and did not chase him at all. But it didn't matter, because the Austrian army was almost instantly rushed to pieces by the aggressive Augereau corps. Chapter 779, March into Italy. The next afternoon, Bolu was discussing with his staff how to attack the port of Toulant most efficiently after controlling Vence, when an officer came in without even knocking on the door. Ignoring the marshal's angry eyes, the man shouted in panic, "Marshal, General Dannenfeld was ambushed on the way to Vence, and almost all of his troops were wiped out. His whereabouts are unknown." Bolu stood up suddenly. What did you say?" The officer swallowed and continued. "Also, General Provera was ambushed by the French army on his retreat. The soldier who sent back the message said that he was going to retreat to Vence and asked for support. To be honest, Napoleon really did not arrange troops to ambush Provera. After all, he didn't know that the Austrian army had abandoned the town of Cannes. This was all because Augereau was too idle and wanted to find something to do for himself, but he accidentally encountered Provera's army. But in Provera's view, the French had been waiting for him here for a long time, so he collapsed at the first touch and turned around and ran. Bolu felt a buzz in his head. The army to reinforce Vence was gone, but Provera was still running towards Vence, so the result was already doomed. The current situation is that the entire battle west of Nice has failed, and the Provera Corps and the Dannenfeld Corps have lost at least 15,000 people. At the same time, the connection between him and Vence has been cut off by the French army. In other words, the nearly 10,000 soldiers of the Sabotendorf Corps are unlikely to come back. He brought 30,000 Austrian troops and 20,000 Sardinian troops to France, and more than half of them have been lost at this time. It seems that he still has 25,000 troops, but in fact, the previous losses were all Austrian troops with strong combat effectiveness, and the remaining Sardinian corps could not fight any decent battles at all. He hesitated for only half a minute before shouting to the herald, "The whole army will immediately withdraw to the Catibona Pass." Order Marshal entered to lead the Royal 7th Infantry Brigade to take over the defense near the pass. The Sardinian Camarabi Corps will be responsible for the defense of Nice. Yes, Marshal. Napoleon received the news that Beaulieu's main force had withdrawn from Nice 2 days after he completely surrounded the Sabotendorf Corps. He was immediately filled with regret. According to his plan, he wanted to block Beaulieu and Nice, but he did not expect the latter to run so decisively. In fact, this could not be blamed on him. The main reason was that Cully had arranged a large number of defenses along the line from Nice to the Catibona Pass, and it was difficult for the French cavalry to get close to reconnaissance. Looking back at the entire Toulon campaign, this was the only bright spot in Beaulieu's command. Napoleon immediately left the Joubert Corps to continue to clean up the mess in Sabotendorf, and led the main force to the Catibona Pass to try to stop Beaulieu. But at this time, most of the Austrian army had retreated to the Italian peninsula, and with Argenteuil's desperate defense, Napoleon ultimately failed to retain Beaulieu's main force. After Argenteuil also entered the Alps, the 1,300 Camullipi troops left in Nice surrendered immediately. 2 days later, Sabotendorf also gave up resistance and surrendered to the French army. In the Monaco castle, Napoleon happily wrote a report submitted to His Royal Highness the Dauphin. The Battle of Toulon was a complete victory, with a total of 8,000 Austrian soldiers killed and wounded, and 15,000 captured. 3 enemy generals, Dannenfeld, Sabotendorf, and Provera, were captured. Major Filippo del Caretto, Beaulieu's son-in-law, and Lieutenant Colonel Camullipi, commander of the Sardinian Vera Corps, were captured. Yes, Napoleon only captured and killed 23,000 enemy troops in the end. Thousands of Austrian soldiers were rescued by British transport ships on the beach southwest of Nice. However, this was still a clean victory. At least France would not be threatened in the southeast from now on. Of course, for Joseph, this only met his most basic requirements. According to his right-wing plan, Napoleon was going to cross the Alps and attack Sardinia, and attack southwestern Austria from the Italian peninsula. Without Joseph's urging, when his commendation order was sent to Toulon, Napoleon had already controlled the Catibona Pass, and the Augereau unit of the front army began to pass through the pass. July 29, 1793. Wearing a brand new colonel collar, Napoleon urged his horse with high spirits, and took the first step to cross the Alps. Yes, after winning the Battle of Toulon, he has been promoted to colonel. All officers involved in this battle have also received promotions to varying degrees. And most importantly, after the easy victory in the battle near Nice, the Italian army no longer had any doubts about the commandability of Napoleon, a young officer. Everyone was full of confidence and high morale, and marched towards Italy. A few days later, Napoleon tightened his collar, sniffed and kicked the mule under his crotch with his heel, looked at the quartermaster staff beside him, frowned and said, "You mean, the winter clothes of the Montpellier Corps have not been delivered yet?" "Yes, Commander." The latter was also frozen, and shrank his neck. "The gendarmes have arrested their 3 logistics procurement officials, but you know, there is still a process from recovering the stolen money to reordering cotton clothes. Because of the abnormal climate in Europe in recent years, there is still snow on the top of the Alps even in August. Although the snow is not large under the warm wind of the Mediterranean, it still brings some trouble. Even Napoleon's mount was exhausted due to the cold, so he had to ride a mule over the mountain. Napoleon was obviously a little angry. The Montpellier Corps has more than 6,000 people. If it cannot pass through the Alps in time, it will seriously affect his strength. How long will it take? He asked the staff. Montpellier promised to solve it within half a month. But you know, their promises are usually not taken too seriously. The Montpellier Corps still belongs to the old army's operating model. Logistical materials are purchased privately by senior officers and then reimbursed to the Palace of Versailles. The General Staff had previously suggested providing them with supplies, but was rejected by the military nobles of Montpellier. What a joke. This is a lucrative job. By forging bills, the reimbursement amount is more than double the actual expenditure. Of course, it cannot be handed over to the General Staff casually. So, the current situation appeared. In fact, this kind of thing is not uncommon in the old army. For example, the Prussian and Austrian armies had several months of preparation time before the war, and most of them were dragged down by similar crappy things. However, Prussia is already preparing to set up a general staff, just to get rid of this drawback. Historically, it was Prussia that first created the general staff model, and then it spread throughout the European continent. At present, European countries are learning the French model. Chapter 780, New Battle of Marengo. Historically, it was not until the 1830s that European countries established general staffs and had them take full responsibility for logistics, topographic mapping, training, and combat plans. Even in France, where Joseph led the reform of the staff system, Napoleon was still deeply affected by the inefficient bureaucracy of the old army. Napoleon pulled the reins and asked the staff to take out the map. He stared at it and frowned for a long time, then shook his head and sighed. I remember that the cavalry battalion of the Moulin Corps seems to be still in Nice? The staff nodded. Yes, Commander. The cavalry consumed too much on the day of the attack on Vence, so they were arranged to pass through the mountain pass at the end, to rest for a few more days. Okay, let them rest for a while, and they don't have to come here for the time being, Napoleon said, motioning to the attendant to get paper and pen, and then he lay on the saddle and began to write a report to the Crown Prince tremblingly. He carefully considered his tone and words, blew a few breaths on his cold right hand, and saw a sharp-eyed middle-aged man standing by a rock not far away. He was holding a drawing board, looking at him from time to time, and then lowered his head to draw a few strokes. Napoleon waved to the man and said, Mr. David, how is your work going? Thanks to you, I finally found inspiration just now. The middle-aged man was still focused on the picture, without raising his head, and said, so, at most in a week, you can see your heroic figure on my scroll. This person is Jacques Louis David, a famous classical painter in history, who painted the death of merit. It's just that merit is still alive now, and there is no turmoil of the Great Revolution, which makes him far less noticeable than in history. David had planned to take a boat to North Africa in Marseille port to try his luck a while ago. It happened that the Archduke of Monaco paid him to paint a picture that can show the majestic figure of Bonaparte in order to thank Napoleon for driving away the Austrians. He followed him up the Alps. Napoleon smiled and nodded at him, then continued to concentrate on writing his report. Half an hour later, he finally finished the first draft and gave it to his staff officer to help him proofread grammatical errors. Then he turned over and jumped off the mule, walked to David's side, and leaned over to look at the drawing board in the painter's hand. At just one glance, Napoleon frowned. In the picture, he saw himself riding a tired mule. His clothes were covered with dust, and the guards next to him, whose cheeks were red from the cold, pulled the reins tightly, fearing that the animal would slip on the snow. This is not a victory to march into Italy. It is clear that they have just been defeated by the Austrian army and are fleeing back to their hometown in embarrassment. He patted David on the shoulder and sighed helplessly. Perhaps we should have a good talk about your masterpiece, Southern Netherlands. Southern suburbs of Brussels. Joseph handed Napoleon's battle plan to Lefebvre, who was standing beside him. Colonel Buvanab's ideas are always unexpected. This time, he has turned the original troubles into opportunities and used them. The latter quickly glanced through the report and said hesitantly, Your Highness, Turin, as the capital of Sardinia, may be difficult to capture quickly. By then, the Montpellier Corps will be fighting alone in the north of Sardinia, and will easily be surrounded by reinforcements sent by Austria. Oh, the Austrian army in northeastern Switzerland is not far away. Joseph smiled. You don't understand Colonel Buvanab's intentions. He attacked from the Great St. Bernard Pass, not necessarily to attack Turin. The greatest significance of this army is to disrupt the Austrians' deployment. After that, he can choose to continue to attack Milan to the east, or go south to form a pincer attack on the Austrian army with General de Mauban. As long as the Montpellier Corps can successfully pass through the bad fortress, our army will have a great strategic initiative. Lefebvre pointed at Napoleon's report in confusion and said, "Your Highness, Colonel Buvanabur only said that Turin could be attacked by surprise and did not mention Milan or the pincer attack." Joseph smiled and nodded. It is possible that he has not considered these for the time being, but you must believe that, as long as the conditions are right, he will keenly think of all feasible plans and choose the best one to implement. The reason why Joseph dared to say this is entirely because the battle plan Napoleon gave him was very similar to the situation during the Battle of Marengo in history. The French army also approached southern Sardinia from the south of the Alps, and the Austro-Saarland coalition retreated to northern Italy. Napoleon also decided to launch a surprise attack from the Great St. Bernard Pass on the north. It can only be said that under similar battlefield situations, the emperor still chose the same tactics. Of course, there are also differences from the historical Battle of Marengo. That is, now that the French Navy will challenge the British in the Mediterranean, the French army in Genoa can obtain supplies from the sea, and will not have to run out of ammunition and surrender as they did in the past. Lefebvre still said cautiously, "Your Highness, Colonel Buvanabur's plan may still face two difficulties. First, his route of advance will pass through Geneva at the southern tip of Switzerland, and the Swiss will raise objections. Secondly, the bad fortress guarding the mountain pass is extremely difficult to break through. The terrain there is dangerous, and only a few hundred soldiers are needed to garrison there to delay the Montpellier Corps for more than a month. Such a long time is enough for Bolu to send reinforcement. Your concerns are very justified." Joseph first affirmed his statement, but his tone was still relaxed. "But this is not an unsolvable problem. Geneva has almost no Swiss garrison defense, and the Swiss parliament will certainly pretend not to see our army passing by. They also allowed the Austrian army to assemble in the Schwyz area, which is fair. For a small country like Switzerland, facing a fight between two giant neighbors, the best strategy is to play ostrich. As long as the fight is not in their own home, they don't want to care, nor dare to care. Historically, Switzerland has always swallowed its anger when facing the occupation of its western provinces by France. Now, the French army is just passing through, and they should know what to do. As for Fort Bad, Joseph deliberately lowered his voice. I know there is a small path nearby that can be quietly bypassed. Lefebvre's eyes widened immediately. How did you know? You shouldn't have been there, right? Joseph thought to himself that of course he heard it from the documentary about the Battle of Marengo, but he just smiled mysteriously. Maybe it's a revelation from God. He left Lefebvre, who was making the sign of the cross devoutly, turned around, picked up a pen, and signed to approve Napoleon's seemingly extremely risky battle plan. Since several chaff signal towers had been built in the southern part of Wallonia in the past month, Napoleon's report took only 2 days to reach here from Toulon. It took the messenger a day and a half to come down from the Alps, and half a day to get to Joseph's temporary command post from the north of Mons. The chaff signal machine took only an hour to transmit the message. Chapter 781. Fight for Genoa. The Alps, east of the Catibona Pass. General Dauphin, the nominal commander-in-chief of the French-Italian front, felt a warm wind blowing from the Mediterranean, and his old bones, which were almost frozen and cracked, finally recovered a little. He remembered the order sent to him by His Royal Highness the Crown Prince a few days ago, and couldn't help but sigh bitterly. He thought that he would just be nice at most to show off the fact that the young Buonarroti commanded very well, and he didn't need to ask at all. But the Crown Prince suddenly asked him to replace Buonarroti and command the army. Dauphin, who was nearly 60 years old, had to drag his old body over the Alps and pretend to attack Monferrato, a province in southern Sardinia. To the north of Monferrato is Turin. At this time, Sardinia was in chaos, and Amelia III kept asking Vienna for help like a madman. After the disastrous defeat in the Battle of Toulon, Bolu had less than 7,000 Austrian troops left on the Italian peninsula, plus the 20,000 Sardinian corps led by Carli, and 2,000 troops stationed in Milan. With this little force, let alone reinforcing Sardinia, he himself was worried whether Milan could be defended. France second had no choice but to send the Swiss front to Italy to assist in the war, and the commander of the Swiss front, Melas, replaced Bolu to command the Italian front. After Melas's vanguard troops arrived in Milan, Bolu finally breathed a sigh of relief. With Melas's 30,000 troops, the situation in Italy was basically stabilized. On the other hand, Amedia III also sent an additional 10,000 soldiers to defend Monferrato. At this time in northern Italy, the total strength of the Austrian-Sardinian coalition had reached 60,000. Dimabin only had 28,000 troops. The general staff added 5,000 new recruits to the Italian front, but they were intercepted by Napoleon halfway. However, he was not too worried, because His Royal Highness the Crown Prince did not really want him to attack Sardinia, but just to show off. If it was just defense, his troops could still hold out for a while. In addition, the Austrian army had just suffered a defeat and their morale was low. If they really fought, they might not pose too much of a threat to him. A week later, Dimapin was enjoying his breakfast. After entering Italy, the food was obviously much better than in the mountains. The staff officer knocked on the door and saluted him, saying, "Commander, I just received news from Milan that nearly 30,000 people from the Melas Corps are heading south to Monferrato." The old general drank some milk and asked, "How far are we?" "About 50 kilometers. Dimapin nodded, stood up and said, "Order the entire army to assemble and prepare to set off eastward." "Eastward?" The staff officer was surprised. "General, there is only Genoa over there." "Yes, Genoa." Dimapin nodded. "That's where we are going." According to the order of His Royal Highness the Crown Prince, which was actually Napoleon's battle plan, once the main force of Austria and Sardinia moved to the south of Sardinia, he would make a full-scale attack on Genoa. Genoa is the most important port in northern Italy. Almost all the materials shipped from the sea to Sardinia and Milan must be landed here. If the French army occupied Genoa, it would mean that the supplies shipped by the British from the sea would not be delivered to the Austrian and Sardinian coalition forces. This was a situation that the Austrian commander absolutely did not want to see. At the same time, the British could not accept Genoa falling into the hands of France, because it carried more than half of Britain's trade with Italy. Sure enough, when Dimabin's army left Ego and began to set out for Voltri, a strategic location west of Genoa, the Austrian army immediately became nervous. North of Monferrato, in the Austrian camp, Carli looked at the officers in front of him and said firmly, "We must maintain the territorial integrity of Sardinia. If Monferrato has problems, we will quickly lose the trust of our allies." Bolu shook his head tiredly. "Once the French army occupies Genoa, it will immediately threaten Alessandria to the north. At that time, we will have to divide our troops to defend the east, west, and north, which will put us in an extremely unfavorable situation. Alessandria is an important transportation hub in northern Italy, connecting Milan, Turin, Piacenza and other cities." Carli was a little angry, but the stubborn Genoese insisted on maintaining neutrality and would not allow us to send troops to assist them in defense. "If we attack the French army directly, we will have to cross the Alps. Before we arrive, the French have already controlled the port of Genoa. The southernmost end of the Alps is a human-shaped structure, and Genoa is right at the end of that stroke, which means that there are many mountains blocking the way between Dimabin and the Austrian army. Although these mountains are not very high, it will take a long time for the army to pass through." Brigadier General Jean-Baptiste Savoni saw that the two sides were arguing, so he stood up and suggested uncertainly, "Perhaps we can ignore the attitude of the Genoese government and set up defenses there before the French army arrives. Starting from Alexandria, it will take a day and a half to get there." Everyone turned to look at him. After a while, Carli said in a deep voice, "But Genoa is a neutral port protected by His Majesty the Emperor. We are just going to stop the French army. We will withdraw from Genoa after we drive the French out of Italy," Savoni argued. "I believe that Britain will certainly agree with our actions." Everyone was silent again. With the military strength of Genoa, whether it is Austria, France, or even Sardinia, they can easily occupy it, as if they were in an empty land. Then, they can be the first to deploy defenses there. In other words, whoever takes action first will gain a huge advantage. Finally, Melas breathed a sigh of relief and nodded. "Well, it's better than letting the French get Genoa. Order the Argentor Corps to rush to Genoa immediately." General Carly will continue to Monferrato to block the French from going north. General Savoni will cross the Alps and cut off the French army's retreat. This time we will destroy the Dimapin Corps in the Voltri area, middle section of the Alps, Great St. Bernard Pass. The quartermaster staff saluted Napoleon and said, "Commander, perhaps we should wait for 2 more days at the foot of the mountain. Our current food reserves are only enough to last until we cross the Alps. After entering Italy, we will face a food shortage." Yes, when Napoleon climbed to the halfway point of the Catibona Pass, he retreated again and instead led the Montpellier Corps, a Moulins cavalry battalion, and 5,000 new recruits just transferred by the general staff, to launch a surprise attack from the Central Alps. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 782, Overlooking Lombardy. Napoleon looked at the white mountain top in the distance, kicked his horse's belly without hesitation, walked towards the hillside, and said to the quartermaster staff, "Don't worry about supplies. Have you forgotten that there is the merciful St. Bernard Abbey on the mountain?" He was talking about a monastery built by the monk St. Bernard de Meun, note 1, in the 11th century on the hillside of the Alps. In the following hundreds of years, after many expansions, it has become quite large, enough to provide supplies for thousands of soldiers. The quartermaster staff was stunned for a moment, and hurriedly caught up and said, "Commander, I must remind you that His Royal Highness the Crown Prince strictly forbids us to privately collect supplies in Italian towns." The so-called collecting supplies is actually a civilized way of saying that soldiers are allowed to rob. Napoleon showed a sly smile. "Yes, we are not collecting supplies in Italy, but His Royal Highness did not say that we cannot accept the gifts from the monastery. Besides, Major Adoric is not here, so some things can be more flexible, right?" Adoric was the military supervisor sent by Joseph to be in charge of logistics. At this time, he was fighting in the Digo area with Dimapin. The quartermaster staff was still trying to dissuade him. "You see, even if we can get the help of the priests, there will still be a shortage of supplies. The supplies in the monastery are enough for the army to consume for a week at most, and after we arrive at the bad fortress, I'm afraid we will have to engage in a long-term siege, so we should wait for the supplies from Brest to arrive before. You don't have to worry about the fortress." Napoleon seemed confident. "His Royal Highness the Crown Prince has helped me solve this problem, and leaving 2 days earlier will give us more strategic initiative." Historically, after crossing the Great St. Bernard Pass, the French army attacked the bad fortress for half a month, but failed to make any progress. In the end, some soldiers heard from nearby herdsmen that there was a path on the side of the fortress, so they were able to slip past under the cover of night. However, because of the previous battle to attack the fortress, the defenders were always on high alert. So at that time, only the infantry of the French army passed through the path smoothly. When the cannons were transported later, they were discovered by the defenders. The Austrian defenders began to block the path with artillery fire. The French army finally had to abandon the cannons behind, and only 6 cannons were able to enter the Italian area. This time, Joseph told Napoleon in advance that there was a path near the bad fortress. The French army could pass quietly without alarming the defenders from the beginning, so there was a high probability that the cannons could be transported through the fortress. As for the specific location of the path, Napoleon would naturally find the locals to ask. 2 days later, accompanied by the sound of military drums, the French artillerymen shouted neat slogans, drove donkeys and mules to drag huge tree trunks halfway up the mountain. This was the idea of the artillery battalion commander Marmont. Hollow out the tree trunks, then stuff the gun barrels in, and tie them up, so that they can be dragged forward on the snow. Without his invention, all the 12-pound guns would have been left at the foot of the mountain. It was impossible to get these nearly 2-ton gun carriages up the steep slope on the snow. Near dusk, the cavalry battalion of the Moulins Corps arrived at the Abbey of St. Bernard first. Without their reminder, the monks hurriedly took out food and wine from the cellar, welcoming the royal division. The abbot also personally sent Napoleon a big red envelope of 200,000 francs, which can be said to be fully fulfilling the landlord's friendship. The next day, Napoleon said goodbye to the abbot, and under the kindness of the abbey, he asked the soldiers to take 8 carts of grain and dried meat from the abbey and continue on their journey. Amid the enthusiastic barking of dozens of St. Bernard dogs behind him, Napoleon said to Marmont beside him, "You see, if Mr. Hannibal had served God, his soldiers might not have to cross the Alps hungry. Oh, there are even extra allowances to be taken." Note 2. The latter wondered, "You mean the allowance?" "Yes, 10 francs per soldier, and officers are given according to their ranks." Napoleon nodded. He took out 150,000 francs from the dean's red envelope and distributed it to the soldiers as allowances. After entering Italy, they became an isolated army in a dangerous situation, so it was necessary to properly boost morale. A week later, Napoleon looked back at the bad fortress behind him and smiled triumphantly. He took a deep breath and said to himself, "Praise your highness the Dauphin. You have given me a vast battlefield, and I will repay you with a glorious victory." Just last night, he ordered the soldiers to spread hay mixed with fesses on the path on the west side of the fortress, to eliminate the sound of footsteps. After more than 3 hours, all the soldiers, artillery, and vehicles of the army successfully bypassed this solid fortress. At this time, what appeared in front of Napoleon was the endless Lombardy plain. Map of northern Italy. Just as Napoleon was about to step into the Great St. Bernard Pass, outside the town of Digo on the west side of Genoa, Roberto Vanoni looked back at the French army winding to the end of his vision, nervously holding the reins, and whispered to Dimabin beside him, "Dear General, that, I have no intention of offending, I just want to confirm it again. When you arrive in Voltri, you will sign an agreement with our country." He was a secret envoy sent by Michelangelo Abiazzo, the governor of Genoa. 2 days ago, an Austrian army brutally invaded Genoa and controlled the local administration and all defense. Abiazzo failed to negotiate with his commander, General Argentor, so he sent an envoy to contact the French army that entered the Italian peninsula at the suggestion of several congressmen. What he didn't expect was that the French agreed without hesitation to help Genoa drive the Austrians away, and repeatedly reiterated that they would withdraw from Genoa immediately after the battle. Dimapin smiled and nodded. "Wait for the governor to send someone to deliver your authorization, and we can sign the agreement immediately." In fact, His Royal Highness the Crown Prince has repeatedly reiterated that Genoa's neutral port status must be respected, and France will never intend to destroy this situation. The Genoese envoy was overjoyed, with a respectful and flattering smile on his face, and said, "Praise the kind and great His Royal Highness the Crown Prince. He is truly the spokesperson of God's order in the world. He has brought fairness and justice to Italy. I swear that every citizen of Genoa will always remember His Royal Highness's selfless help." Note 1. Saint Bernard de Meung, Bishop of Aosta and Administrator of the Alps. In order to facilitate the rescue of travelers, he established a monastery and hospice at the high point of the Alps. His monks, with the help of well-trained search and rescue dogs, rescued many people trapped in the mountains due to bad weather, and provided food and clothing. Saint Bernard Search and Rescue Dog. Note 2. Hannibal Barca, ancient Carthaginian military strategist, who led his army across the Alps to attack the Roman Republic in 218 BC. Due to the backward logistics and transportation capabilities at the time, tens of thousands of soldiers froze to death, or starved to death in the process, but he finally arrived in Italy with difficulty, and dealt the Roman army an unexpected blow. Chapter 783, Sandbag's Self-Cultivation. After Dimabin and the Genoese envoy finished blowing their rainbow farts, he gestured behind himself and continued, "You should know that the Austrians can cut off our army's retreat at any time. I took a very big risk to go to Genoa this time." He sighed solemnly. "Perhaps I will be surrounded and unable to return to France." Vanoni was stunned for a moment, put his hands on his chest, and said affectionately, "There is no general more brave than you in the world. Thank you for everything you have done for Genoa." If someone told him that in history Napoleon did drive away the Austrian army that occupied Genoa, but he never left here again until he was defeated, and he also borrowed money to empty the Genoa treasury, I wonder what this envoy would think. Of course, Joseph had no intention of occupying Genoa at all. On the contrary, it is in the best interest of France to ensure the independence of Genoa. This is an important handle for controlling trade in northern Italy. Only by protecting the regime here as much as possible can Sardinia avoid unifying the entire Italian peninsula. From a geopolitical point of view, the existence of a bunch of small countries around France is far more advantageous than the emergence of a unified big country. Not to mention the economic aspect. Small countries have limited industrial capacity and can only open their markets to big countries. Otherwise they cannot even meet the daily material needs of the people. Especially at the moment, when the Italian people are beginning to awaken, it is not easy to rule Genoa. After eliminating the Genoese government, it will help Sardinia remove the obstacles to unification here. Dimabin nodded and cut to the point. You see, I was originally planning to return to France, so I almost didn't prepare logistical supplies. Once the fight starts, I'm afraid. Vanoni was very sensible and immediately patted his chest and said, please rest assured, our country will do its best to ensure your logistical supply. That's great. Dimabin looked towards the port. Let's work together to defend Genoa. On the banks of the Po River across northern Italy, in the city of Alessandria, Melas was playing chess with Bolu while tasting coffee. The latter's army had just experienced a great defeat and needed to rest for a while, so he could not do anything in the near future and could only stay in Milan, and he was idle. General Argentor is very efficient. It took less than 2 days to completely control Genoa. Melas put his rook on the opposite bottom line. What do you think the French will do next? Bolu picked up the horse to block the side of the king and thought, from Dimabin's previous command, he was very responsive and deployed the army very quickly. If General Savoni was delayed for a while, he would probably escape back to Toulon. Until this time, Bolu still believed that the Battle of Toulon was commanded by Dimabin. There was no way. Napoleon was still too young and not famous. Bolu could never have imagined that he was defeated by a lieutenant colonel in his 20s. Melas still respected the old marshal in front of him and nodded, saying, you are right. So, I want the Argentor Corps to take the initiative to attack the French to slow down the retreat. In that case, you need to send reinforcement to the Argentor Corps. Yes, I plan to transfer the garrison in Milan to him. The defense of Milan will be left to you. Bolu smiled and picked up the elephant. Thank you. It seems I can rest for a while. In his view, the main force of the French army is concentrated in the south of Sardinia and between Milan, Turin and Alessandria, which is completely in the rear area. As the two were talking, an officer walked into the courtyard quickly and stood at attention to Melas, saying, Commander, I just received a message from General Argentor that the French army is approaching Genoa. Melas paused with his hand holding the chess piece and looked at Bolu in surprise. Are the French crazy? How dare they not withdraw from Italy and continue to move eastward? It must be that the previous victory has made Dimabin lose his mind. Bolu showed a happy expression. In this way, you will have enough time to mobilize superior forces to surround him in the Genoa area. Victory has never been so close to us. When Melas heard him mention victory, he couldn't help but think of the official sent by His Majesty the Emperor last week to convey the commendation for the great Battle of Toulon. Poor Count Hellingsetzer didn't know that the Austrian army was actually defeated in Toulon until 2 hours before arriving in Milan. He was so embarrassed that he couldn't move forward or backward and finally had to claim that he had lost the edict and fled back to Vienna in embarrassment overnight. Melas dispelled the messy thoughts in his mind and walked quickly to the map, his eyes full of the spirit of a beast seeing its prey. The Savoni Corps continues to move south and divides its troops to control the Catibona Pass. The Carli Corps goes to Novi Ligure and cooperates with the Argentor Corps to encircle Dimabin. Valigia is a small town in the north of Genoa, but it controls the passage from Genoa to Alessandria in the north. After Melas's order is passed on, more than 50,000 Austro-Sardinian coalition forces will gather in the Genoa area, fiercely cutting off all chances of Dimabin's survival. But he did not notice that the troops in the entire Lombardy region had been allocated by him, and there were few left. The town of Voltri on the coast of northern Italy, outside the temporary command post of the French-Italian front. Commander, I still think that we should use our main forces to ensure the smooth passage of the Catibona Pass. Joubert looked at the army preparing to launch a general attack on the port, making a final effort. Only then can the reinforcement from Paris arrive here through the pass. Then it will be the best time to have a decisive battle with the Austrians. Attacking Genoa at this time will only make us lose all logistical channels. There won't be any reinforcement, Dimopin said, motioning to the herald. Launch a general attack. Then he looked at Joubert. The first batch of reinforcement has joined Colonel Bouvanaber's corps. Ah. But where is his corps now? I don't know either. Dimopin tucked his cane under his armpit, picked up the telescope, and looked at Genoa. This is an order directly issued by His Royal Highness the Crown Prince. But according to my guess, we are playing the role of sandbags here, and Colonel Bouvanaber is a right hook. He is indeed a veteran in the old French army. Regardless of his command ability, he still has a strategic vision. And the opportunity is very good now. Dimopin handed the telescope to Joubert. The Austrians are obviously not fully prepared for our active attack. We should be able to capture Genoa soon. The day before yesterday, when the French army raided the town of Voltri, it was a similar situation. The Austrian army gathered by the road, as if they were about to start marching, but the French army captured this place in just 3 hours. Chapter 784, Siege of Genoa. Argentor initially thought that the French were just fainting. After all, judging from the current situation, it would be the most reasonable tactical choice for them to retreat to the west and defend the Catibona Pass. It was not until Voltri was breached that he finally realized that Dimopin was serious. So he hurriedly called back the troops sent out for a diversionary attack, but it was obviously too late. Dimopin's vanguard, the Moulin Corps, almost followed the Argentor Corps to the Turquino Pass, and then launched a fierce attack. The Turquino Pass is on the west side of the port of Genoa, and is at the end of the Alps. Although it is several kilometers wide, it is the only terrain outside Genoa that can be used for defense. Argentor looked at the French cannons roaring on the high ground in the north, and asked the staff officer beside him loudly, "So how long will it take for our reinforcement to arrive?" "General, according to the news sent yesterday at noon, the Tavernier Corps has already set out from Milan." Argentor frowned immediately. Even if they marched quickly, it would take a week to get from Milan to Genoa. He didn't expect the French to be so desperate and put almost all their forces on the battlefield. He only had 7,000 soldiers, and it was difficult for him to hold out for so long under the attack of more than 20,000 French troops. Argentor was thinking about how to delay until the reinforcement arrived, when a captain hurried over and reported in a very embarrassed manner, "General, 2 hours ago, a group of Genoese thugs set fire to our warehouse on Caneve Avenue." The so-called thugs were actually dozens of young nobles from Genoa. They received a secret order from Governor Biazzo to sabotage the rear of the Austrian army. The warehouse requisitioned by Austria was the family property of one of them, named Agradi. Agradi led his companions into the warehouse through a hidden small door with familiarity, and then summoned the servants here. They were requisitioned as porters by the Austrian army, and effortless set fire to more than a dozen places in the warehouse at the same time. The 2 ships of supplies that the British transport ship had just delivered the day before were instantly reduced to ashes. Caneve Avenue? Argentor was stunned for a moment, and his face suddenly changed. There were rations for the Legion and some artillery shells stored there. Genoa is a place that does not produce any food, but thanks to the huge profits brought by maritime trade, they can always spend money to buy food from North Africa or Sicily. But there are only 60,000 to 70,000 people in Genoa city, and the sudden increase of more than 7,000 troops immediately caused a food shortage. Originally, the food and grass shipped by the British were enough for Argentor to consume for more than half a month, but now the warehouse was burned, and he had to cut off the food immediately. The next batch of transport ships will not arrive for half a month. On the battlefield, a dozen infantry columns of the Moulin Corps suddenly rushed up quickly and spread out on the left wing of the Austrian army, and then the percussion guns burst into dense flames. Under the fierce shooting, the Austrian defense line suddenly showed signs of shaking. Argentor hurriedly ordered a reserve battalion to go up and barely stabilized the situation, but then he saw the French infantry line appear on the north side of the mountain pass, and more than a dozen cannons began to move forward. Argentor looked at the overwhelming French offensive and couldn't help but secretly complain. According to this trend, his defense line can only last for 3 or 4 days at most, if the food is not exhausted before that. Food? He suddenly thought of something. The French completely ignored their western passage and used all their forces to attack Genoa, so soon the Savoni Corps would be able to control the Catibona Pass, which was the logistical supply channel of the French army. So it was completely meaningless for him to confront the French head-on here. The French army should be allowed to enter Genoa in exchange for time for the reinforcement from Milan to join him. When the French ran out of rations in Milan, they would have to surrender without wasting a single shell. It should be said that Argentor's plan was correct. In the historical Battle of Marengo, Messina, who was placed in Genoa as bait by Napoleon, struggled for more than 50 days in a severe lack of food, and finally had to surrender with hungry soldiers out of the city. At present, Messina was transferred to the Rhine battlefield by Joseph, and the veteran de Maupin was going to attract firepower here on his behalf. However, de Maupin was lucky because he would receive supplies from the French Navy in the Mediterranean. History would not repeat itself on him. The next morning, when de Maupin ordered the soldiers to launch a new round of attacks, he unexpectedly found that it was quiet near the Catibona Pass, and the Argentor Corps had retreated eastward last night. 2 days later, Joubert led 2 infantry regiments and entered the city of Genoa, which was not defended by the enemy, under the welcome of the Genoese. De Maupin did not waste any time. After a short rest, he ordered Joubert and Augereau to build a defense line outside Genoa. He himself came to the governor's palace in Genoa and read out the promise of His Royal Highness the Crown Prince to always support Genoa's neutrality and never interfere in Genoa's internal affairs, and urged the Habsburg family to repay the decades-old debt owed to the Genoa Bank as soon as possible. Yes, Genoa began to decline gradually in the 18th century, which had a lot to do with the fact that the Habsburg family borrowed a lot of loans from them, but refused to repay them. Of course, most of them were borrowed by the former Spanish Habsburg royal family, but who can calculate these old debts so clearly? As for the loan owed by France to Genoa, the Crown Prince said that the French valued credibility the most and guaranteed to repay the principal and interest. Well, when the war in Italy is over, these debts will be transferred to Austria in the form of war reparations. The French will never default on their debts. A week later, the Sardinian Corps led by Carli arrived in Novi Ligure. Immediately afterwards, the Savoni Corps approached the Turkino Pass from the west. At this point, nearly 50,000 Austrian and Sardinian coalition forces completed the encirclement of the de Maupin Corps, and after a few days of rest, launched a fierce attack on Genoa, northwest Italy, Novara. In the officer's tent of the French camp, Napoleon quickly drew 3 arrows on the map with a pencil, and then looked at the officers in front of him with burning eyes. Now we have 3 options. Attack Turin to the south. This can force Sardinia to withdraw from the anti-French alliance. Southeast, this is the farthest way. Go to Genoa and attack the back of Melas' army. If General de Maupin cooperates well, it can form a pincer attack on the enemy. He pointed to the arrow on the far right. To the east, attack Milan and occupy the Austrian base in Italy. Marmont said without much hesitation, Commander, we should still give priority to the safety of General de Maupin. According to the intelligence sent yesterday, he is surrounded by an enemy force that is almost twice his size. Chapter 785. The army arrives at Milan. Victor immediately shook his head and said, no, this will waste the opportunity we created by crossing the Great St. Bernard Pass. Our biggest advantage at the moment is that the enemy has not yet realized that their soft belly is exposed to our guns. We should attack Milan immediately, which is the core of the entire battlefield. I believe that there should not be many enemy troops defending Milan at this time. As for General de Maupin, we should believe in his command ability. He will definitely be able to defend Genoa. Marmont raised his voice and said, the Italian front will soon run out of supplies. No matter how brave they are, they can't repel the enemy on an empty stomach. The two began to argue, but no one mentioned Turin. In the minds of French officers, Sardinia is basically a gift. Who would go to great lengths for a gift? After a moment, the two looked at Napoleon together. Colonel Buvanab's strategic planning ability is obvious to all, and he has to make the final decision. Napoleon's eyes wandered between Genoa and Milan. After a moment, he stood up, put his arms around the shoulders of his two men, and said with a smile, "Why do we have to make a choice? I will not give up Milan and Genoa. How is this possible? Commander, I'm afraid there is not enough time." Napoleon picked up the small wooden stick and pointed at Milan. "What do you think? If our army captured Milan, how would Melas respond?" Victor pondered. "They should send troops back to support." "That's right." Napoleon nodded. "In this way, the pressure on Genoa will be greatly reduced, and we can choose multiple positions to intercept Melas' reinforcement, and thus gain the initiative on the battlefield in one fell swoop." Marmont said carefully, "But General de Maupin will find it difficult to get supplies." Napoleon shook the stick in his hand. "The quartermaster will get the necessary supplies for the general from the citizens of Genoa. I think he will have no problem holding on for 2 months." In fact, the idea buried deep in his heart could not be said. That is, if de Maupin died in battle or was captured, he would rightfully become the commander-in-chief of the Italian front. After the war is won, all the credit for the Italian campaign will belong to him. By then, he will be promoted to Major General at least, and it is not impossible to be promoted directly to Lieutenant General. Seeing that Marmont still seemed to be hesitant to speak, Napoleon continued, "The number of enemy troops besieging Genoa seems large, but there are 20,000 Sardinian troops among them. You have also seen their combat effectiveness in Toulon, so there is no need to worry about them. When Melas transfers part of the Austrian troops back to Milan, General de Maupin will even have a chance to launch a breakout. All problems will be solved." As he said, he swung the small wooden stick in his hand vigorously, as if it was a sharp sword. "Okay, let the soldiers rest for an afternoon, and we will set off for beautiful Milan tomorrow morning. Countless wealth and girls are waiting for us there, in the city of Milan." Bolu kept shaking his head, and spent several minutes trying to recall whether he had ever prayed sincerely enough, because he felt that he was cursed. Otherwise, why would the French always suddenly appear in front of him, as if they had emerged from the ground? This is definitely a terrible curse. Yes, half an hour ago, the hussars reported to him that more than 10,000 French troops were rapidly approaching Milan, and they were only 20 miles away. Since he was defeated many times by the inexplicably appearing French troops in Toulon, the importance of reconnaissance has increased several times, and there is always a cavalry squadron scouting around. But this French army still appeared strangely. This is Milan, the rear area. In addition to the Alps, there are the Austro-Saharan coalition forces around. Where did these French come from? He made a cross on his chest, interrupted his own wild thoughts, turned his head to look at the map on the wall, and looked at the officers beside him. Several officers lowered their heads. There was silence in the room. Milan did have more than 8,000 soldiers, but they all knew that these soldiers had just experienced the disastrous defeat in Toulon, and their morale was very low. Even a small half of them had not yet completed the reorganization. Such an army could not guarantee its combat effectiveness when facing the French army with a numerical advantage. Perhaps the same people who defeated them not long ago. According to the marching speed of the French, they would launch an attack on Milan, the core city of the empire in Italy, in 3 days at most. At this time, a tall colonel stood up and said loudly, "Marshal, it is now the flood season of the Po River. As long as we hold on to the Valenza ferry, we can effectively block the French army. Even if Valenza is lost, we can still retreat to the Ticino River. Although there is no dangerous terrain here, if the ships along the coast are destroyed in advance, the French advance can still be slowed down. I think it is entirely possible for us to hold out for 20 days and wait for the reinforcement sent by General Melas." Bolu did not expect that at this time. All the generals under his command were dejected, and this cavalry colonel named Lepte was the only one full of fighting spirit. He carefully considered Lepte's plan, and now it seems that the only way is to send troops forward and defend the river. We can't just abandon Milan and retreat. His Majesty the Emperor will definitely throw himself into prison without hesitation, without a military court trial. He took a deep breath and said to Lepte, "Then you will be fully responsible for the defense of the Valenza ferry. The infantry regiment and the skirmisher regiment will also be under your command." "Yes, Marshal." Lepte stood at attention. "Thank you for your trust. I will definitely hold on until the reinforcement arrive." On the west bank of the Po River, Napoleon looked at the turbulent river rushing in front of him, bent down, picked up a small branch, and threw it into the river. As soon as the branch touched the river surface, it was hit by the strong current, and bounced back and forth, and disappeared a few seconds later. He couldn't help but frown slightly. The reconnaissance troops that had just forced the river across reported that the Austrian army had set up artillery positions on the opposite bank, and were ready to blow up the bridge at any time. He was confident that, if he coordinated with the appropriate artillery bombardment, as long as he launched a strong attack, he could seize the ferry on the other side of the river in 3 to 5 days. But that would definitely bring serious casualties. He was not sympathetic to the soldiers, but if the loss of troops was too great, when Melas came back to help, he might not have enough troops to fight him. Napoleon carefully observed the Austrian army on the opposite bank with a telescope again, and suddenly turned to the staff officer and said, "Let the soldiers line up in front of the river bank, and don't stop the drumbeat. Oh, be careful to stay out of the range of the enemy's artillery." The latter asked, "Which regiment are you referring to?" "All soldiers, except the cavalry battalions and grenadiers," said Napoleon. "We must try to look as imposing as possible." Chapter 786 The Emperor's Courage. The staff officer cautiously confirmed again, "You mean, including the reserve army?" Napoleon pointed to the open area opposite the wooden bridge with his whip. "Yes, including the reserve army, even the engineering company, gather there." "Yes, Commander." Half an hour later, nearly 10,000 French soldiers lined up in 3 neat rows on the bank of the Po River. On their left wing, the 14 cannons of the artillery company began to pour shells on the opposite bank, but because the distance was too far, many shells fell into the river. But the Austrian army on the east bank of the river could only see the flashing of fire under the thick smoke, the rumbling of artillery in their ears, and the solemn and murderous atmosphere of the battlefield was absolutely full. Not long after, Victor and Captain Grouchy, the acting commander of the cavalry battalion, came to Napoleon one after another. "Commander, the grenadiers and cavalry battalion have assembled." Victor stood at attention and saluted, then glanced at the battle on the river bank. "Are we going to launch a general attack?" Grouchy added nervously, "But the boats to cross the river are not ready yet. A forced attack now will." "No, no one said we were going to cross the river and attack." Napoleon waved his hand to interrupt him, then looked at Victor. "Major Victor, let the cavalry and grenadiers prepare for a forced march." "Well, perhaps we should pay enough attention to General Melas. You can select another 1,000 veterans from the infantry regiment to accompany him." "Ah, forced march." Victor was stunned for a moment, but immediately shouted, "Yes, I'll go now." Napoleon watched the 2 men leave, then turned to look at several civilian officers beside him, and quickly chose one of them, Lieutenant Marcelin. "I remember you seemed to have been a lawyer before." "Yes, Commander." "Then your eloquence should be excellent, right?" "That's not outstanding, but I have received professional training in public speaking." "Very good. Now I appoint you as the negotiating representative. Go to the other side and urge the Austrians to surrender." Napoleon glanced at his military uniform. "Remember to change into a colonel's uniform." "Negotiate? Me?" Lieutenant Marcelin was a little overwhelmed. He was just an ordinary clerk. He calmed himself down and took out a pen and paper to record. "Okay. Please tell me, what conditions should we offer?" Napoleon took the reins from the attendant and said without turning his head, "Whatever you say, just keep dragging the negotiations." "But," Marcelin, who was suddenly entrusted with a heavy responsibility and looked embarrassed, wanted to ask more, but he only saw Napoleon's receding back. It was 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Napoleon left Marmont to command the main force, to confront the Austrian army, and he personally led 3,000 soldiers, and rushed south along the Po River. The 6 or 7,000 Austrian troops on the other side were listless, and had no intention of attacking. Marmont's main job was to make a big noise, and show his presence. Victor shook the reins lightly, letting his mount walk a few steps faster, to keep parallel with Napoleon, and then lowered his voice and asked sideways, "Commander, what are we going to do?" The latter said indifferently, "Of course, we are going to capture Milan." "Milan?" Victor looked back at the main force that was too far to see clearly, and said in surprise, "Only these few people. Enough." Napoleon smiled. If I'm not mistaken, Melas will definitely transfer most of his troops to Genoa to besiege General Dauphin. The troops left in Milan should be very few. And the officers responsible for defending Milan obviously don't want to fight us head on, and have pushed the defense line far to the Po River. That is to say, Milan's limited troops are now on the other side of the river, and the city is very empty. 3,000 people. No, according to my original plan, 2,000 people are enough to occupy there. Victor's eyes widened in shock. Then where do we cross the river? Lodi. Victor understood immediately. Lodi is on the south side of Milan, where the Ticino River merges into the Po River. From there, we only need to cross the Po River, avoiding the trouble of crossing the Ticino River again. But he immediately thought of another problem. He looked at Napoleon and said, "Commander, it is nearly 70 kilometers from here to Lodi, and there are Austrians everywhere along the way. If they report our whereabouts to Milan, our trip will be a waste of time. No need to worry." Napoleon pointed at the Po River with his whip. Why do the Austrians set up defenses along the river? They want to take advantage of the flood season. The water of the Po River is very turbulent, and it is difficult for our army to force a crossing. But he forgot that the fierce river water would also hinder the transmission of information. No one would be willing to risk being washed away by the current to report news to the other side that they themselves don't know whether it is useful or not. So, as long as we are fast enough, Milan will never notice it. There was only admiration in Victor's eyes. He also thought of an advantage that Colonel Buvanaba didn't mention. That is, the section of the Po River from Valencia to Lodi is an L shape. The river water will be greatly slowed down at the bend, and the water level will be relatively mild when it reaches Lodi. This greatly reduces the difficulty of crossing the river. Just build a pontoon bridge and transport the soldiers, horses and cannons. If it were the water flow in Valencia, this would be absolutely impossible. Napoleon turned his head to look at the troops on his side. He was not very satisfied with the marching speed. He frowned and thought about it, and gave a few instructions to the staff officer beside him. The latter immediately turned his horse's head and shouted to the soldiers, "Everyone speed up." The commander asked me to promise everyone that all soldiers who arrive in Lodi within 4 days will receive a subsidy of 20 francs. If they arrive within 3 days, each person will receive 35 francs. If the time to Lodi does not exceed 2.5 days, then each person will receive 50 francs. The soldiers were immediately excited. The marching column seemed to be pushed hard by an invisible giant hand from behind, and the speed increased instantly. You know, the soldiers of the Montpellier Legion only had a salary of 11 francs per month. 50 francs was equivalent to 4.5 months of net income. Even the cavalry of the Moulin Legion had a monthly salary of only 28 francs. This subsidy was also very attractive to them. And generally speaking, the allowance of cavalry should be increased by several percent on the basis of infantry. Stimulated by the huge bonus, Napoleon's assault troops arrived at the place where the Po River turned east at dusk the next day. It was only 35 kilometers away from Lodi. Who said that the old army's marching ability was not good? It was because the francs were not enough. As long as the bonus was in place, the soldiers wished they could grow donkey hooves, and walking 30 kilometers a day was not a problem at all. 2.5 days after Napoleon left Valencia, his 3,000 troops successfully crossed the Po River, occupied Lodi without bloodshed, and pointed their swords at Milan, which was just around the corner. Chapter 787, Lombardy Victory, Milan. In Baron Tremolone's villa, Bolu, who was recuperating there, looked at the report just sent by Lepte, with a disdainful smile on his face, and said to the officer beside him, "Tell Colonel Lepte that we can agree to the French request not to blow up the bridge and use this to delay for another 2 days. We will still need this bridge when we go to Alessandria in the future. In less than half a month, reinforcement from Genoa will arrive. Let Colonel Lepte retreat to the Ticino River." As he was speaking, an officer stumbled in and said in a frightened voice, "Marshal, traces of the French army were found in the southern suburbs, at least 3 or 4,000 people, and they also have a lot of cavalry." Bolu stood up from his chair and subconsciously made a cross on his chest. Oh God. The curse came again. Lepte just reported that there were tens of thousands of French troops opposite him. So where did these thousands of people come from? Are the French rabbits? They can come out from anywhere. Bolu's face turned pale as he signaled his attendant to bring his uniform. He turned to the officer beside him and shouted, "Quick, let Major Martinelli prepare for battle." He shook his head dejectedly halfway through his speech. There were only more than 400 soldiers in Milan, 150 of whom were his guards, and most of the others were slightly injured and were not suitable to follow Lepte to the Po River defense line. It was impossible to defend Milan. Bolu looked at the officer who called the police. "How far are the French from here?" They left Lodi in the early morning, and it is estimated that they are about 6 miles away from Milan at this time. 6 miles is less than 10 kilometers, and it can be walked in half a day at most. Bolu hesitated for a few seconds, put on his coat, and ordered the herald, "Let Major Martinelli assemble the troops and retreat with me to Mancia." Mancia is a fortress in the east of Milan, guarding the passage from Lombardy to Austria. Austria has been operating there for many years, and has built the fortress extremely solid by taking advantage of the dangerous terrain. As long as he could escape to Mancia, he would be safe, even if tens of thousands of French troops came after him. When Melas led the main force back to support him, he could turn the situation around, no matter how unfavorable it was. The outer suburbs of Milan. The terrain on the southeast side of Milan is relatively flat, suitable for cavalry deployment. Napoleon pointed to the map on the saddle and instructed Grouchy, "The grenadiers will block the enemies rushing out of the city on the flanks. You must move as quickly as possible from." "Commander," a ranger lieutenant suddenly came to him and gestured to his side. "This is a negotiator sent by Milan, Count Rael." "Negotiator?" Napoleon looked at the man in a black suit. "Milan, not the Austrian garrison." The negotiator saluted him respectfully. "Your honorable and brave commander, on behalf of the Milan City Hall and all the citizens of Milan, I extend my most cordial and humble greetings to you." Napoleon narrowed his eyes and asked, "Where are the garrisons in the city?" Marshal Bolu left Milan 4 hours ago." The surrounding soldiers heard this and burst into thunderous cheers. "The cowardly Austrians have escaped. We won. Aha, Milan belongs to us. Did you hear that? It's that Bolu, haha. I wanted to teach them a lesson." Napoleon signaled to Grouchy, "Take someone to confirm it." "Yes, Commander." An hour and a half later, Napoleon stood outside the city of Milan and saw from a distance a large number of citizens on both sides of the road, holding bouquets to welcome him. Yes, with the awakening of Italian national consciousness, the rule of the Austrians here has become increasingly unpopular. When the news spread that the French army had driven away the Austrian army, the Milanese felt liberated and came to welcome the royal army. However, in history, France soon incorporated Milan into its territory, and the people here soon joined the anti-French movement again. Grouchy on the side said, "Commander, do you need me to chase Bolu?" Napoleon shook his head. "He has run far away. It may be difficult to find him." "Then let's go into the city." "No." Napoleon frowned and looked to the west. "We still have important things to do." "Major Victor." "I'm here, Commander. Leave 4 companies to control Milan," Napoleon said, turning his horse's head. "The others follow me to intercept Lepte." Victor and Grouchy looked at each other. Both of them were surprised. After leaving 4 companies, they only had more than 2,600 soldiers. The Lepte Corps had more than 6,000 people. At the moment, it was good enough to set up defenses in Milan immediately, if they could hold it. Colonel Buvanaba actually wanted to take the initiative to attack. Seeing the two in a daze, Napoleon said loudly, "Lepte has no idea about the situation of our army. He must be worried about being attacked by us and Marmont. So after he learned that Milan was occupied by us, he would definitely choose to retreat to Alessandria instead of coming to recapture Milan." Grouchy and Victor nodded together. "Then we return to Valencia immediately?" "No, Bolu should have sent someone to inform Lepte. He is definitely not in Valencia." Napoleon signaled the staff to unfold the map. "I don't know if Marmont has pursued to the south. Let's go to Pavia." Pavia is at the L-shaped bend of the Po River. Lepte wants to go to Alessandria on the southwest side of the Po River, and he will most likely cross the river from here. Napoleon glanced at Milan behind him again and said calmly, "I will be back soon." The next afternoon 4 kilometers east of Pavia, 2 rangers reported to Napoleon, "Commander, a large number of Austrian troops were found near the riverbank." Napoleon nodded, waved to the already very tired soldiers and said, "The great victory is just ahead." Follow me to finish these last 4 kilometers, and there will be no Austrian troops in Lombardy. After returning to Milan, you will receive your allowance immediately." The soldiers immediately perked up, but they had just walked less than 1 kilometer when they heard bursts of artillery fire from the south. Napoleon frowned. "Did Lepte discover us?" He turned sideways to Grouchy and gestured, "You take the cavalry, to delay the enemy first." "Yes." However, just over 10 minutes after the cavalry battalion left, another ranger returned to report, "Commander, Major Marmont's troops are fighting the enemy." Napoleon smiled. "Well done, Victor, let's go and help him." But when they arrived at the Po River, they only saw Marmont commanding the soldiers to drive groups of prisoners together. In the open space in the distance, various guns, flags, drums and the like were piled up into a small hill. Chapter 788 Harvest. In front of the Pavia position, Napoleon raised his hat to Marmont from a distance to show his approval. "Your outstanding performance simply surprises me, Auguste. I didn't contact you, but you accurately chose the best interception position and dealt a fatal blow to the enemy. I was originally prepared to face a tough battle, but now, haha, we can sit down and have a cup of coffee." Marmont seemed a little guilty and urged his horse to hurry forward. "I just did what I should do. In fact, the enemy is vulnerable by the way. I heard from the captured officers that you have successfully captured Milan." He was not being modest. In fact, his main forces were on their way to Milan. He had discovered that Lepte had suddenly retreated and guessed that the latter was going to reinforce Milan, so he ordered his troops to pursue eastward. But he was also worried that Lepte was going to Lodi to intercept Colonel Buonaparte. If Napoleon's assault force was moving slowly, it was possible that they had not yet crossed the Po River. So, out of worry, he led 2,500 soldiers himself to rush to Lodi along the east bank of the Po River. As a result, as soon as he arrived north of Pavia, he found that the Austrian army was gathering there. At first he thought he was ambushed, but he didn't expect the enemy to collapse at the first touch. Then Marmont's more than 2,000 people captured more than 4,000 Austrian soldiers in a magnificent manner. How could he know that after seeing him? The Lepte Corps determined that it was the main force of the French army coming from Milan to attack them. This army had been severely beaten by Napoleon in Toulon before, and its morale was low. They were so scared that they knelt down and surrendered immediately, and Lepte couldn't stop them. "Yes, I have successfully controlled Milan." Napoleon looked around and asked in confusion, "Why are there so few soldiers? Where is our main force?" "They are on their way to Milan, Commander." When Napoleon asked about the situation, he immediately said to Marmont, "Send someone to catch up with them immediately and let them wait outside Milan." "Yes, Commander. But why do you do this?" Napoleon looked at the line of prisoners of war that was 1 kilometer long and smiled slightly. "We need a grand ceremony to enter the city." 2 days later, rhythmic artillery fire was heard outside Milan, followed by military music. On that day, all shops and factories in Milan were ordered to close, and tens of thousands of citizens gathered on both sides of the road in the south of the city, looking out into the distance. Soon, a team of majestic French cavalrymen, holding the Golden Iris flag, the Montpellier Corps flag, and the Moulin Corps flag, lined up in neat rows, and walked through the crowd. Behind them, a French infantry regiment carrying August percussion cap rifles, loudly scolded a large number of dejected prisoners, and slowly walked into the city. Those prisoners were all wearing tattered Austrian uniforms, and some of them had blood on their bodies and faces. Napoleon specifically ordered them not to wash. Some onlookers began to throw clods of earth at the Austrian soldiers. God is my witness, this was not a shill arranged by Napoleon in advance. Before the shill had time to do anything, the Italians could no longer bear it. Soon, dirt and even excrement were flying everywhere, hitting the captives and making them scream. In the end, the French soldiers came out to maintain order, and the citizens of Milan stopped. Otherwise many captives would have been killed. There were as many as 4,000 to 5,000 captured Austrian soldiers, and they walked for an hour and a half before they all entered the city of Milan. After someone quickly cleaned up the debris on the road, a loud trumpet sounded everywhere. A short officer wearing a white hussar uniform and a tricorn hat, surrounded by hundreds of guards cavalry, as well as a large number of drummers and organists, walked past the people with his head held high. Someone took the lead in shouting, "Long live His Majesty the King of France. Glory and victory belong to General Buonarrota. Praise the great French Heavenly Army. Welcome the Liberator." Well, this time it was Napoleon who arranged the babysitter. The cheers soon resounded throughout Milan, and people were so excited that they celebrated their victory by singing and dancing in the streets, as if their own army had defeated the Austrians. At this moment, all Milanese knew that the Habsburg rule over Milan had come to an end. A grand banquet kicked off in the Milan City Hall. Napoleon and more than a dozen French officers sat at the top, and all the prominent nobles and wealthy businessmen in Milan gathered here, hoping to get acquainted with the French. Napoleon listened to the elegant music, his eyes swept across the oil paintings on the walls of the hall, and he turned his head to the deputy speaker of the Milan Parliament and said, "I'm really moved by the enthusiasm of my friends in Milan, especially the donations you provided for my soldiers. Oh, a full 2 million francs. You are really the most generous people I have ever met. I swear, I will use my life to ensure the safety of Milan." Giuseppe, the deputy speaker of Milan, was stunned when he heard this. There was indeed a donation to the French army. It was customary for new conquerors to give a little gift when they entered the city, but the amount was wrong. He subconsciously said, "Well, did you remember it wrong? It should be 400,000 francs. Napoleon's voice suddenly became cold. "Oh, I clearly remember that it was 3 million. Could it be that someone embezzled the donation? It seems that I have to let the gendarmes investigate in Milan." Giuseppe's heart suddenly twitched. The meaning was obvious. If there was number 3 million francs, many people would definitely be thrown into prison. At present, the governor of Milan, Ferdinand, and the Austrian speaker of the parliament had fled to Vienna, and Giuseppe is the highest executive of Milan. He knew that, if he could not satisfy the French, they would definitely replace him with an obedient person, and he would most likely become the embezzler. He hurriedly apologized with a smile. "Oh, I mean there are still many donations being counted, and the total amount is indeed 3 million francs. All donations will be delivered to your headquarters before noon the day after tomorrow." Napoleon nodded with satisfaction and continued, "You know, our army has come from the far west of the Alps for the freedom of Milan, and now there is a shortage of logistical supplies. I hope you can prepare a month's supply for my soldiers." "Oh, about 15,000 people, including food, wine, oats and gunpowder. A week should be enough, right?" Giuseppe forced a smile. "1 week, of course. I promise you will see enough supplies by then." Napoleon also smiled, leaned close to his ear and said, "By the way, I heard that Raphael's The Marriage of the Virgin is in the governor's palace?" "Yes, yes." Giuseppe nodded, and continued very politely, "It should belong to a collector with taste like you. Oh, and Michelangelo's. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 789. My last name is Bonaparte. Giuseppe continued to nod. "Yes, the painting is currently in the Basilica of San Lorenzo. If you like it." After Napoleon listed 8 or 9 top works of art in a row, and received Giuseppe's promise of gift, he finally smiled brightly, and raised his glass to the nobles of Milan. "Cheers to the brave French soldiers." Everyone hurriedly raised their glasses and stood up, saying in unison, "Cheers to the brave French soldiers." Napoleon suddenly thought of something, and said in a louder voice, "Cheers to His Majesty the Great King. Cheers to the Son of God." More than 100 nobles in the hall repeated it, and then drank the wine in the glass. After Napoleon sat down, a nobleman with a face full of pits on his left side leaned forward to flatter him and said, "Colonel Buonarrota, I guess you must have Italian ancestry, so Milan is destined to be liberated by you." Napoleon frowned. "Italian ancestry? Why do you say that?" The nobleman obviously did not notice the change in his expression, and continued to try to get close to him. "Buonarrota, you see, this is such a typical Italian surname. Anyone from the Apennine Peninsula will know that you are one of them as soon as they hear it." He also said to the people around him with self-satisfaction, "Everyone, is this right?" A burst of echoes suddenly rang out from all around. The Milanese nobles all believed that saying someone is one of them is a very close and flattering statement. However, Napoleon's face darkened, and he shook his head very stiffly. No, I'm French, and do not have the slightest Italian ancestry. Yes, he was no longer the Corsican restorationist. He now has only one identity, that is, a senior French general who once followed His Royal Highness the Crown Prince to fight in the southern Netherlands, and led the French army to sweep across Lombardy, gaining supreme glory. What Italian ancestry? They were just weaklings who were conquered by me, and allowed me to ask for money and property without even daring to fart. How could I have anything to do with these weaklings? The nobleman with the sequelae of smallpox on his face had not yet reacted, and said with a smile, "How could it be? Your last name sounds like..." Napoleon slammed the wine glass on the table with a bang. "I don't want to repeat it a second time. I'm French." The Milanese nobles looked at each other, lowered their heads, and dared not speak again. Even the band was so scared that they stopped what they were doing, and the hall was instantly silent. General Sepala stepped out to smooth things over. "Colonel Buvanaba, please don't be angry. Count Ganella has no intention of offending you. Oh, he also donated 100,000 francs to your army, which is enough to show his sincerity." Ganella was so scared that he was sweating all over his head. He nodded hurriedly. "I apologize for my recklessness. Oh, 100,000 francs. Yes, I donated 100,000. He actually only donated 8,000 francs, but at this time he didn't dare to say anything more. 100,000 is 100,000, as long as it can calm Colonel Buvanaba's anger." Napoleon's expression eased a little, and he picked up the wine glass and gestured to Giuseppe. Then soothing music sounded in the hall again. After the banquet, Napoleon did not attend the subsequent dance. On the pretext of busy military affairs, he returned to his command post in Baron Tremoloni's villa. He entered the office and immediately began to write an application, which was to change his surname Buvanaba to the more French Bonaparte. He is now the most senior person in the Buonaroba family, and his brothers all depend on him for their future, so as long as he decides to change his surname, no one dares to object. Napoleon wrote the application and handed it to the clerk for revision and polishing. Then he copied it twice and told his servants to hand one copy to the Royal Committee of the Palace of Versailles, which is the agency that manages the status of the nobility, and the other copy to the Minister of Household Registration. After doing all this, he breathed a sigh of relief. From now on, he is a real Frenchman. The next day, the main generals of the corps gathered at the headquarters and held a combat meeting. Victor first reported on the situation of clearing out the remnants of the Austrian army in Milan. At present, more than 200 people have been arrested. Basically, all Austrians with some status have been thrown into prison, and the arrest is still going on. After he finished speaking, Marmont immediately reminded, "Commander, we have to go to Genoa as soon as possible. General de Maubin has been besieged by the enemy for more than a month." Napoleon just listened and did not comment. In fact, he had already received 2 letters from de Maubin asking for help, indicating that the situation in Genoa was already very urgent. "Commander?" Marmont was about to say something else, but Napoleon raised his hand to interrupt him. "The most important thing for us right now should be to eliminate the remaining enemies in Lombardy as soon as possible. Otherwise, once we go south, our retreat may be cut off by them at any time." Well, after Bolo escaped, the entire Lombardy region had less than 2,000 Austrian troops in several cities, and they were all troops responsible for local security, with basically no field combat capabilities. However, when Napoleon didn't want to rescue Genoa, these troops were a serious threat. Marmont, but Napoleon continued, "General de Maubin has rich command experience, and the Austrians can't defeat him so quickly. As long as we completely control Lombardy, we can set up a line of defense along the Po River to cut off the connection between Western Italy and Austria. Melis's main forces are currently around Genoa, which means that Napoleon used Lombardy and the Alps to counter-encircle them from a larger range. And Melis will definitely give up Genoa and choose to have a decisive battle with us. At that time, the pressure on General de Maubin will naturally disappear." Napoleon did not give his subordinates a chance to question, and ordered, "Captain Grouchy, lead 2 cavalry squadrons to Varese immediately. Major Marmont, lead the 3rd Infantry Regiment to capture Como and Bergamo. Melis reinforcement will arrive in Milan in a week at the earliest. Before that, you must end the battle and return. Yes, Commander. While Napoleon was preparing to raid Milan, Genoa was in a tough battle. In the French frontline command post, Dauphin rubbed his ears, that were numbed by the sound of artillery fire, and shouted to the staff officer next to him, "Is there no news from Colonel Buvanaba?" The latter shouted just as loudly, "Not yet, General. I have sent 3 groups of people to slip out of the enemy's encirclement, but there has been no response." The ground suddenly shook. It should be a heavy artillery shell that fell near the command post. The British transported several 24-pound cannons to Melis by sea, with a very long range, posing a huge threat to the Genoa defense line. Dimabin seemed to have gotten used to it, and shouted, "How long can our food and ammunition last? The shells and gunpowder are enough for half a month, but there is less than a week's worth of food left." Chapter 790, Maneuvers in the Mediterranean. Dimapin frowned. Before he entered Genoa, a group of reckless young men burned the food warehouse, which prevented him from getting any food from the city. According to the order of His Royal Highness the Crown Prince, he had to hold out in Genoa for 2 months. And there was no food for the next 20 days. During the past month, his troops suffered heavy casualties under the fierce attack of 50,000 enemy troops. If there is another shortage of rations, the soldiers will probably collapse immediately. The ground shook again. Junot pushed the door open and said anxiously, "Commander, the enemy has launched a large-scale attack from the north." Dimabin hurriedly grabbed his hat and put it on his head, striding towards the north front with his 60-year-old legs. After running a few steps, he turned back and shouted to the staff, "If there is a ship docking at the port, report to me immediately." "Yes, General." Junot helped Dimabin to bring the warhorse, and said a little frustrated, "There are British warships outside the port, and our ships can't come in at all." Dimabin struggled to mount the warhorse with the help of his attendants, panting, "His Royal Highness the Crown Prince promised me that there would be supplies, so the supplies will definitely be delivered. What we have to do now is to repel the damn Austrians and hold here." As he spoke, he waved his whip and ran up the high ground in front of him for easy observation in the dust. He took the telescope handed by the attendant, but subconsciously looked at the port behind him first, and said to himself, "God bless, let me see the transport ship earlier." 10 days ago, in the northeast of the Mediterranean, near the Ligurian Sea of Genoa, in the officer's room of the Victory, the flagship of the British Mediterranean Fleet, Lord Hood was boredly flipping through a yellowed sailing record, and occasionally took a sip of tea. There was a knock on the cabin door, and the voice of Major General Collingwood came from outside. "Commander, the old silver coin just returned to report that there were unusual movements in the French fleet in Toulon port." Lord Hood's eyes suddenly lit up. He got up and put on his coat and said loudly, "Call all captains and senior officers to the conference room." "Yes, General." 20 minutes later, in the conference room of the Victory, Hood pointed to the waterway between Toulon and Genoa on the map. "Colonel Nelson, I order you to command the frigate fleet and keep a close watch on this waterway. Don't miss any French ship." "Yes, General." Normally, it would never be the turn of an officer of Nelson's rank to be in charge of the frigate formation. Usually a lieutenant colonel is enough to command 7 or 8 frigates, but the core of this raid on the French fleet is to find their whereabouts, and Hood must not allow any mistakes, so he sent Nelson to supervise it personally. Hood looked at the staff officer next to him again. "Immediately contact General Hotham's squadron and let him be ready for battle at any time. He must at least delay the main force of the Toulon fleet for half a day." Hotham was commanding a squadron including 4 third-level ships, 5 fourth-level ships, 5 fifth-level battleships, and 16 frigates at this time, carrying out a blockade mission on the waterway outside the port of Genoa. Although this squadron is far smaller than the French Toulon fleet or the Mediterranean fleet, Lord Hood believes that with Hotham's command ability and the British sailors' skilled ship handling skills, it is enough to hold the French for 6 or 7 hours. His main fleet is hidden 60 nautical miles southeast of Genoa. It can get supplies from the port of Tuscany at any time, and can rush to Genoa to join the battle within half a day. As long as the Toulon fleet dares to show up, he will definitely be able to annihilate it this time. The French may feel that there are risks in going to Genoa, but Hood knows that they must go to Genoa, even if they take risks. because nearly 30,000 French troops are surrounded there. If they cannot get logistical supplies from the sea, then this army will have only two results: surrender or starve to death. It happened that Hood had decided to lift the blockade of Toulon and lead the French fleet out of the port so that he could destroy them, and then he encountered the opportunity of Genoa being besieged. The battle in Genoa has lasted for nearly a month, and the French can no longer sit still. Soon, as Hood's order was passed down, all the warships of the British Mediterranean fleet were ready to go. After more than half a day, a British galley quickly sailed to the side of the Victory, and the second mate delivered the latest intelligence to the conference room. The French fleet went southwest. Lord Hood looked at the officers of the frigate with a puzzled look on his face. "Did you see it clearly?" "Yes, Admiral." The second mate stood at attention. "The long-toothed shark is still following them. There are a total of 16 main battleships, 20 secondary battleships, and a large number of frigates." Hood frowned immediately. This scale is definitely the main force of the Toulon fleet, but they did not go to Genoa. Major General Collingwood on the side pondered. "General, maybe the French want to join the Spanish fleet and then go to Genoa together?" Hood nodded slightly. "This is the only possibility." He looked at the real-time fleet position map on the wall and ordered the staff, "Let Colonel Louis' squadron go to the Bay of Valencia to search immediately. If you find any trace of the French, try to interfere with them and report to me immediately." Louis commanded an escort squadron. Because the French frigates attacked British merchant ships everywhere before, the scale of this escort fleet was not small, equipped with 2 third-class battleships. At present, this squadron is on the west side of the Barbary Sea, only half a day's sailing from the Bay of Valencia. Hood then looked at the officers in front of him and said loudly, "Order all warships to weigh anchor immediately. We will go to Valencia. If the French and Spanish fleets really meet, we can save some trouble. This time we will destroy them together." He had enough confidence to say this, because even if the French and Spanish fleets were added together, they were only 80% of the size of the British one. And Hood also had part of the Dutch fleet in his hands. 20 minutes later, hundreds of warships of the British Mediterranean fleet sailed majestically to the west of the Mediterranean. At noon the next day, just as Hood was proudly discussing with several senior officers how to defeat the French and Spanish fleets at the lowest cost, the frigate Long-Toothed Shark sent the latest movements of the Toulon fleet. In the commander's cabin of the Victory, the captain of the frigate stood straight and said, "General, the French turned south on the east side of the Gulf of Lion, and they should be very close to the north side of the Barbary Sea." Hood felt a surge of anger, and said in a deep voice, "What on earth do the French want to do? Go on vacation in North Africa?" Nelson, who had just arrived, read the report of the Long-Toothed Shark. Because the Toulon fleet did not go to Genoa, his patrol mission was also cancelled, and said to Lord Hood, "General, no matter what the French plan, as long as we always stay to their north, we can block their route to Genoa." Chapter 791, Battle of Genoa. Nelson continued, "In fact, the current position of the Toulon fleet is very unfavorable. When Genoa's supplies are exhausted, they will have no choice but to have a decisive battle with us. At that time, we can calmly choose the place of battle and arrange the formation in advance. And once they are defeated, which is almost an inevitable result, they can only flee south to the port of Bizet. We can take advantage of the situation to blockade the port, and the French will have no warships available on their southeast coast. Our marines can even occupy the port of Toulon." "I agree with your judgment very much." Lord Hood nodded, turned to the staff officer and said, "Order the fleet to deploy in the direction of Sardinia, to prevent the French from slipping past us. Southwest of the Mediterranean Sea, in the waters of Sicily 68 sailing warships are moving slowly on the sea. Those huge hulls, with a demeanor that covers the sky and the sun, do not have much indomitable momentum. Instead, they look a little bleak. This is the main force of the French Toulon fleet. They are enough to defeat the navy of any country in the world, except Britain. Unfortunately, the enemy they are dealing with in the Mediterranean at this time is the British fleet. The largest ship in the fleet, like a city on the sea, is the flagship of the Toulon fleet, the Orient. This is one of the few heavy battleships produced by the French Navy in recent years. It was originally named the Dauphin, but Joseph did not like this giant ship that was sunk in Egyptian history, so he finally changed it to the Orient. The core parameters of the Orient, such as size, armament, and hull thickness, all exceed those of the British Victory, and are ranked alongside the Spanish Holy Trinity as the strongest battleships in the world. Although the Holy Trinity has more guns than the Orient, it is inferior in terms of hull structure and flexibility. In terms of actual combat effectiveness, it may be even worse than the Orient. At this time, in the spacious combat meeting room of the Orient, the commander-in-chief of the Toulon fleet, Brueys, looked at the nautical chart with a serious face, constantly measuring the longitude and latitude on it, and circling some positions. The fleet's chief of staff, Major General Anthony Gandam, looked out of the porthole, and couldn't help but sighed. It's really a bit unwilling. I guess the British should be laughing at us in some sea area. Brueys said without raising his head. It must be difficult to be pleasant as a bait, General Gandam. You have to get used to it. But speaking of ridicule, I believe that there will always be a day when you laugh at the British. Yes, no one would have thought that the main force of the French Toulon fleet was just a bait. Their goal is to lead the British Mediterranean fleet away from Genoa and do everything possible to avoid fighting. The main force of this operation is the Mediterranean Fast Squadron, which was recently formed. This squadron is equipped with steam-powered warships, with a total of 25 frigates and 8 fifth-level cruisers. It is commanded by Commodore Blanche de Siagera. Their mission is to tear open the British blockade of Genoa. Currently, Hotham's powerful squadron is stuck off the coast of Genoa. Normally, Hotham's 3rd and 4th level ships alone are enough to destroy the Fast Squadron, but de Siagera must defeat them, or at least drive them away. Brueys finally straightened up, pointed to the chart with a pencil, and said to Gandam, "Next, we will turn to Sicily. Lord Hood will definitely think that we are going to bypass Sardinia and go to Genoa from the east." Gandam showed a rare smile. "Then, we will change to sail west. Maybe there will be a chance to meet up with the Spanish fleet." Brueys nodded. "I hope General de Siagera can complete the task smoothly." Dozens of nautical miles away, the British Mediterranean fleet sailed north for a while, preparing to intercept the Toulon fleet, and then chased the latter in a rage, heading towards the Spanish coast 25 nautical miles south of Genoa harbor. On the British third-class battleship Theseus, Major General Hotham personally arranged the patrol route of the frigate, and after confirming that it was foolproof, he yawned. The main force of the French Toulon fleet was far away in the Sicilian waters. It was impossible for the Spanish fleet to come and attack Genoa. Even if the Spanish were really crazy, Louis' squadron was watching them, and they could get the warning in advance. However, Hotham was not in a good mood. He could not participate in the battle to defeat the Toulon fleet, which made him one step slower than his colleagues in the future promotion. He walked out of the cabin, came to the front deck, and looked at the sea in the distance. At least let the French send some transport ships over. If a large number of materials for transporting personnel could be captured, perhaps they could barely make up for some of the losses in military exploits. It seemed that his casual prayer was really heard by God, and a galley that was speeding in the distance continuously sent out flag signals. Without anyone else telling him, Hotham was almost the first to see the flag signal. He was overjoyed, and turned to the messenger and said, "Quick, all ships prepare for battle. A French fleet is approaching." He walked to the command room at the bow, and said to the staff, "Come and tell me immediately when you have the specific number of enemy fleet intelligence." Usually, the first alert ship to discover the enemy will return to one at the first time, and then another ship will scout the specific number, ship type and other information of the enemy, and then make a detailed report. However, this time Hotham did not wait for the detailed information of the enemy fleet. Because his reconnaissance galley was not as fast as the French fast squadron, it had been left out of sight. After an hour or so, Hotham finally learned the specific number of the enemy fleet. He saw it with his own eyes. At this time, the French fleet had rushed to a place less than 3 nautical miles away from him. Hotham put down the telescope and sneered with disdain. The French sent only 8 cruisers with more than 20 frigates. This was no different from sending them to their deaths. His squadron had 4 third-class ships and 5 fourth-class ships, which were enough to crush the French boats. He also had 5 cruisers and 16 frigates. Hotham was not unaware of the French steam battleships. Many British merchant ships and frigates had been sunk by them before. However, the British Navy quickly developed a countermeasure, which was to use its powerful firepower and sturdy hulls to form a battle line and fight steadily. The French ships only had the advantage of fast speed. As long as they entered the range of the battleships, they would be blown to pieces almost immediately. As Hotham's flagship Theseus issued a series of orders using flag signals, more than a dozen British battleships quickly formed a straight battle line and took the upper wind without panic. Chapter 792, Battle of Genoa 2nd. 20 minutes later, more than 30 French warships appeared on the Southeast Sea. When the British sailors on the Theseus saw the French boats emitting black smoke, they couldn't help but smile sarcastically. The largest ships were level 5 ships, and they didn't even have the qualifications to join the battle line. They could only be responsible for the outer perimeter. At the same time, the formation of the French fleet was also loose. It was neither a standard charging oblique formation nor a linear formation. It was just like a group of leisurely sightseeing boats. Moreover, the southwest wind was blowing on the sea, but the French were coming from the east in a semi-adverse direction. Some British soldiers began to suspect that the French were not coming to fight because the latter made almost all the mistakes that could be made in a naval battle. However, British officers such as Major General Hotham still maintained due caution towards the fleet emitting black smoke in the distance, because they had noticed that even in a semi-adverse state, those ships still maintained a very high speed. The captain of the Theseus turned his head and suggested to Hotham, "General, our wind direction is very favorable. If we rush directly downwind, we should be able to crush those small boats directly." Note 1. In the naval battles of this era, whoever seizes the upper wind can quickly adjust the formation with the help of wind power during the battle and freely choose the angle of entry. It can be said that half of the battle has been won, not to mention just bullying a group of light warships. Hotham shook his head hesitantly. "No, observe first. The French are not idiots. They dare to rush over like this. Most of them rely on something." He looked at the herald on the side. "Let the four-wheeled carriage take a few galleys to meet them and disrupt their route." "Yes, General." Soon, the 5th level cruiser four-wheeled carriage on the left side of the British battle line led another 2 cruisers and 8 frigates and quickly approached from the right front of the French warships. This is clearly bullying the French, because their ships are small and the auxiliary warships of the British fleet can threaten them. If the French warships choose to turn left and greet the four-wheeled carriage and other ships with broadside guns, the latter will immediately leave the battle, and the French warships will lose the best angle of entry because of the early turn. Generally speaking, the warships on the charging side have to wait until they are about 800 to 1000 yards close to the opponent's battle line before turning and entering the broadside shooting state. If you turn too early, you can only go around the sea and find the angle of entry again. But the main force of the British fleet is still lying the upwind. How can they give you a chance to re-enter? As long as you dare to turn your head, they will rush over directly and use the neat formation to defeat you in one fell swoop. Seeing that they have approached 800 yards from the French ship, Captain Edbine of the four-wheeled carriage immediately raised the signal flag and ordered to prepare to turn left and pass from the left rear of the French fleet. Of course, if the French forcibly maintain their course, they will engage in battle. Although they would suffer losses, the French warships that entered the battle would also be entangled. The Theseus on the west side would only take 15 minutes to rush over and end the battle. However, the French warships reacted beyond the expectations of all the British. They turned left. Dozens of white traces appeared on the sea in an instant. The French fleet turned sharply at almost a 90-degree right angle and suddenly crossed in front of the four-wheeled carriage. The black muzzles on the side of the ship pointed directly at the bow of the British warship. The people on the four-wheeled carriage and other 10 ships were shocked. This is simply too unreasonable. The French made such a sharp turn in the state of headwind. No, even if it is a tailwind, it takes at least twice the turning radius to cross in front of them. The French warship was just like being pushed from the side by an invisible monster on the seabed, and the bow was directly pointed to the northeast. In other words, at this time, the French warship had completed a standard T-shaped crosshead tactic. Byrne hurriedly ordered the signal flag to be raised, and the warships behind him turned right and sailed south as quickly as possible with the help of the wind, to minimize the contact time with the enemy ships. He had heard before that the French steam warships had a very high turning efficiency, but he had never thought it could be this high, due to the confidence, or arrogance, that the British Navy had cultivated over the years. The reports of ships that escaped from the cannons of French steam warships were always considered to be exaggerated. After all, when attacked, no one could carefully measure the turning rate. They could only report in general that French ships turned very quickly. After analysis, the British Admiralty believed that, as long as they had a favorable wind, with the British sailors' ability to operate the ship, they should not lose much to the French ships in turning. At this moment, Byrne and others realized that they had been badly cheated by the masters of the Admiralty. The sailors on the four-wheeled carriage and other ships desperately adjusted the sails. The helmsman turned the rudder to the head, but they were preparing to turn left before, and it was too late to adjust the reverse at this time. A dozen ships had just turned their bows less than 20 degrees, when they were already within the range of the French warship's cannons. The 32-pound gun on the port side of the French steam cruiser Tunis roared first. Then, the cruisers and frigates following it began to fire in succession. A thick white fog suddenly filled the sea, as if in a fairyland. The four-wheeled carriage basically still had its bow facing the enemy ship, and it was impossible to fight back, and could only passively take the beating. Byrne listened to the kai-kai whistling of shells around him, and his heart was already pumping into a ball, and he felt that the density of firepower seemed to be too great. It was like facing a third-class battleship. Soon, a click sound came from the lower left, which was made by the shells tearing the hull. Then, the same sound was heard on the portside gun deck, followed by the screams of the injured sailors and the shouts of the boatswain ordering the sails to be turned. On the Theseus in the distance, Hotham, who was holding a telescope, also had a gloomy face. This was the first time he saw a French steamship in combat. The amazing speed and turning efficiency made him feel a heavy pressure. Moreover, the formation of the French warships in the attack was also very strange. It was not a standard line array, but an arc, forming a semi-encirclement of the four-wheeled carriage and other ships. This formation allowed them to exert firepower that was 20% to 30% stronger than a line array. Note 1. According to the British naval combat norms, the fleet commander does not directly manage the flagship, he just stays on the flagship to command the entire fleet. The flagship itself has its own captain. This model has many advantages. One of the more important ones is that when the flagship is sunk, the fleet commander can transfer to another ship and quickly switch flagships without causing confusion in the command system on the new flagship. Chapter 793, Battle of Genoa 3. In fact, sailing warships sometimes use this arc formation to attack, but sailing ships adjust their angle slowly. Once they are arranged in an arc, it takes a lot of time to regroup if they want to maneuver in a horizontal formation. So unless one side has an absolute advantage, sailing warships basically fight in line formations. The maneuverable and flexible steamships do not have this concern. As long as the sailors are skilled in operating the ship, the formation change can be completed in a few minutes, so they can be fired in the best attack method. This is also the reason why Byrne felt that the firepower of the French warships was too fierce. Under the interference of the French warships, the four-wheeled carriage and other ships took 7 or 8 minutes of artillery shells and failed to get out of the opponent's firepower range. Hotham finally couldn't sit still. Although the loss of a few cruisers and frigates was nothing, those French boats surrounded and beat his ship right under his nose, which was a complete humiliation. He suppressed his anger and said to the herald, "Raise the flag, move the battle line eastward, and prepare to attack the enemy fleet." On the sea in the distance, the British cruiser White Coral seemed to have been hit in the ammunition compartment and began to burn fiercely. The sailors wailed and jumped into the sea, forming a circle of raindrop-like ripples around the ship. The four-wheeled carriage and quartz sand were seriously damaged and had begun to tilt. Several other ships were also injured to varying degrees and floated in place, almost losing their maneuverability. Only 2 paddle boats were lucky enough to escape the battle because they were at the end of the formation. In just 10 minutes, the British cruiser formation that went to disrupt the French fleet formation had lost more than half. This damage efficiency was so high in the era of sailing warships that it could be included in naval textbooks. On the other side, the British battleship formation sailed at full sail and pounced on the French warships. Hotham looked at the enemy ships outside the porthole and silently estimated in his heart 2,000 yards, 1,500 yards, 1,200 yards. He was about to give the order to prepare for battle when he saw the French flagship raising the signal flag. The 30 or so small boats immediately accelerated with great efficiency, turned around, and then headed northeast in a mess. The speed was as fast as a pack of hyenas that had just stolen the lion's prey and were happily escaping. When the British battle line was connected to the four-wheeled carriage and other warships, there was only a large white track left on the sea and a faint smell of coal smoke in the air. The French ship had appeared a nautical mile away. 2 British cruisers and a frigate were on the verge of sinking, and the other 3 were in very bad condition. It was unknown whether they could hold on until they were towed back to the port. Hotham felt that he had a lot of anger, but nowhere to vent it, and he punched the steering wheel frame hard. Damn the French, what a bunch of cowards, cowards. He gritted his teeth and growled, come and have a manly fight with me. The French fleet in the distance seemed to have heard his words, and quickly circled around, turned around, and still sailed towards Hotham from the north in the seemingly loose formation as before. Hotham sneered and loudly ordered the battle line to adjust its direction, move to the upwind, and try to face the enemy with the broadside. Half an hour later, the French steam warship formation surpassed Hotham's battle line, and took the lead, in occupying the upwind position on the west side. The British commander's face began to look a little unnatural. At first, it was obvious that his position was further west, and the French ship even circled north to avoid him, but he actually arrived at the upwind position first. He had to order the formation to tighten up, keep the bow pointing northeast, and prepare for the impact of the enemy ships. To be honest, he was not afraid of the attack of the French fleet. With the solid hull of the third level ship and the firepower of up to 74 heavy guns, even if the wind direction was disadvantageous, those French small boats could be quickly destroyed. Then, the French battleships moved. With the wind in their favor, their speed soared to more than 12 knots, and they arrived 800 yards from the British battle line in almost the blink of an eye. Then, they suddenly turned right, and in Hotham's surprised eyes, they sailed towards the end of the British battle line at a very fast speed. There was no intention of engaging in a battle line fire. Hotham was a little confused, but he soon understood that the French small boats could not fire at him, so he hurriedly ordered the formation to adjust its direction and keep its side facing the enemy. But the speed of the steamship that had the upper hand was completely incomparable to the clumsy 3rd and 4th tier battleships. The steamship was fully powered, constantly adjusting its angle, and then it passed by the southernmost end of the British battle line in an extremely unreasonable way. The 4th tier battleship Rough Shark at the southern end turned desperately, but when the French battleship passed by 400 yards away from it, it still faced the other side with its tail. The French cruiser poured a round of shells at the thick fin shark in the form of a reverse T-shaped horizontal head, or should it be called a T-shaped horizontal tail. Although each ship only had one chance to fire a salvo, after the continuous bombardment of 7 or 8 ships in front and behind, the stern of the thick fin shark was already eroded, and even the stern sail was seriously damaged. The French fleet did not want to fight at all. When the 4th class ship finally turned around with difficulty, the steamships that did not join the attack immediately turned sharply to distance themselves. Hotham watched those guys with black smoke going away and really wanted to order a pursuit, but reason told him that with the speed of his own formation, it was impossible to catch up. The staff reported to him the damage of the thick fin shark. Fortunately, it was not too serious and could still continue to fight, but the stern sail was broken, which might slightly affect the speed. Hotham ordered another ship to go to the tail of the formation to protect the thick fin shark in the middle. Then, he saw the French warship spewing black smoke and rushing over fiercely from a mile away. At this moment, he remembered the group of hyenas he saw when he went hunting in Africa a few years ago. Each of them is much smaller than a lion, and they are no match for the lion in a head-on fight, but they always use their flexibility to harass the lion when the lion is eating. Many times, he saw hyenas successfully eat the prey captured by the lion, and even bite the lion all over in a sneak attack. At this moment, the French warships that were howling towards this side were simply a group of hyenas, and he was like a powerful but helpless lion. This time, He ordered 3 battleships to protect the tail of the formation in a column. But after those Ionas quickly circled his battle line several times, they successfully pulled out a gap and took the opportunity to carry out a T-head attack on the Caesar, which was a little far away from the formation. After injuring the bow girder of the Caesar, they sailed away again. It was not until dark that the French fleet stopped its harassment and sailed southeast, gradually disappearing on the sea level. Chapter 794 Hotham's Countermeasures. The staff officer brought Hotham the fleet's loss statistics. The groans of injured sailors could still be heard faintly outside the officer's cabin, even though the officer had sternly ordered them to keep quiet many times. Hotham threw the loss report aside in annoyance. He didn't need to read it at all, because he personally participated in the whole day's battle and knew the losses clearly. The French fleet launched a total of 5 attacks, damaging 1 third-class ship and 2 fourth-class ships. Well, the damaged third-class ship was the Theseus he was on. Although there were only 2 barrel-sized holes on the bow deck, which had almost no impact on the combat, the French shells caused 16 sailors to be killed or injured. The situation of the 2 fourth-class ships was similar. The ships were not seriously damaged. The thick-fin shark lost its stern sail, which was the most serious, but there were many casualties among the sailors, which would greatly affect morale. Of course, he automatically ignored the losses of the cruiser formation that initially harassed the French fleet but was counterattacked. Those small boats were nothing to him. Hotham and the senior officers held a meeting until 2 in the morning, but still failed to come up with any effective countermeasures. They only sent 2 ships to contact Lord Hood's main fleet. The next day, a scene similar to yesterday was staged again. The flexible French steam warships kept rushing up to bite the huge British battleships, and then quickly turned around to avoid them, organized the formation, and rushed up again. They kept harassing them until the sun set, and then they blew away with a whistle. However, after yesterday's practice, the French sailors obviously mastered the tactics more proficiently, which allowed them to launch a total of 6 attacks, and damaged 4 British warships. In the meeting room of the Theseus, Hotham was almost going crazy. He could obviously sink the French boats with a round of salvos, but he couldn't touch them, and could only be beaten in frustration. Especially the thick-fin shark. Today, because of its slow movement, it was once again attacked by the French. A large part of the rear right side was blown off, and several cannons fell into the sea from the gap. "General, I think my ship has to return to Gibraltar for repairs," the captain of the roughened shark whispered. "I'm worried that the superstructure at the stern will collapse." Hotham frowned and shook his head. The French are probably replenishing supplies at a port on the north side of Corsica. It will be very dangerous if they find the roughened shark after leaving the formation. Lieutenant Colonel Smith on the side said angrily, "General, we should seek to take the initiative to attack. As long as we can find an opportunity, we can annihilate those French cruisers." "That's exactly what the French expect." Colonel Harriet opposite him immediately objected. "As long as we chase those ships emitting black smoke, the French transport fleet will immediately sail out of the port of Marseille and deliver supplies to Genoa." Someone whispered, "And we can't catch up." Lieutenant Colonel Smith said loudly, "Then we can't stay here all the time. The French cruiser will be here tomorrow." The others all nodded subconsciously. "Yes, we can't continue to be passive. We must think of a way." "Transport fleet?" Hotham repeated these 2 words, and suddenly raised his hand to signal everyone to be quiet, and said, "We will leave here tomorrow morning." "General, but the port of Genoa." Hotham smiled. "We will head towards Marseille, so that we can intercept the French transport ships on the way. After that, we will keep maneuvering in the waters between Marseille and Genoa to avoid harassment from French cruisers." In an age without airplanes and radars, it was very difficult to find an irregularly maneuvering fleet on the sea. If the French wanted to find the Genoa squadron, they had to disperse a large number of warships. By the time they discovered the trace of the British fleet and gathered the warships to organize an attack, several days would have passed. Hotham knew very well that time was on his side. Even if Lord Hood did not lead the main fleet back, the battle in Genoa port would be over in a dozen days. He just had to try to drag it out for 10 days. But Hotham himself did not notice that he had unknowingly been thinking only about how to delay time instead of defeating the French fleet. You know, he had 9 battleships in his hands, while the other side was only a group of cruisers or even frigates. The next morning, when the French steam battleship formation arrived on the south side of Genoa port, they found that the British fleet was gone. Commodore de Ciagula immediately dispersed the frigates to search the area within 20 nautical miles and confirmed that the British had left. Standing on the foredeck of the Tunisia, he exhaled. It seems that the British are even less patient than I thought. He signaled to the staff officer beside him, contact Marseille immediately and tell them that the blockade of Genoa has been lifted. Yes, General. The steam frigate Cape Parrot was running at full speed, and it took only 1 day to deliver the good news to Marseille. The first batch of 3 transport ships, which had been prepared long ago, immediately left the port and sailed to Genoa. However, the day after the transport ships entered the waters of the Côte d'Azur, they encountered British galleys. Not long after, the huge monster-like figure of Hotham's Genoa squadron appeared on the eastern channel. The transport ships turned around and fled in a hurry, but because they were loaded with too much cargo, the speed of these ships was very slow. In the end, only 1 ship successfully returned to Marseille, and the other 2 were captured by the British fleet. On the Tunisia, Brigadier General de Ciagula's face was as hen. He did not expect that, although the British had left the port of Genoa, they were patrolling in the waters of the Côte d'Azur. With the speed of the transport ship, it would be difficult to find a gap to slip through. Next to him, the captain of the Cape Parrot suggested, General, should we go to Marseille for escort? Before Commodore de Ciagula could say anything, he shook his head. Their steam warships were only good at harassment, but could not be used for escort. The British battleships could completely withstand the attacks of their small boats and sink all the transport ships. For the third-level ships, sinking the transport ships was just a matter of a few rounds of salvos. Commodore de Ciagula gripped the railing on the deck tightly. In more than 10 days, General de Maubant's logistical supplies would be exhausted. Although he repelled the British fleet, he did not expect the British to use shameless delaying tactics. At this moment, a timid voice appeared behind him. General, I may have a way to supply the Genoa games. De Ciagula turned his head and saw a 20-year-old non-commissioned officer. He tried to recall and said, Henry Demville? Are you a senior sailor in charge of the mainsail? It's me. Demville bowed nervously. I'm honored that you remember my name. Chapter 795 Sea Power is Everything. Although de Ciagula did not hold out much hope, he still asked, do you have any way to bypass the British fleet? No, there is no need to bypass them. Demville half lowered his head and said, you know, I used to do business in the UK, and then the strait was too strictly controlled, so our captain wanted to try his luck in the Ottoman Empire. Get to the point. Oh, yes, General. Demville spoke faster. We transited at the port of Piraeus, where supplies are abundant. De Ciagula frowned, but it's too far away, and we are too late. The port of Piraeus is in the Morea region of Greece, more than 700 nautical miles away from Genoa. No, there's still time, General. I heard that Piraeus started using steamships for trade half a year ago. Demville said, there are many French merchants doing business there. He took a deep breath. The most important thing is that the British will never expect supplies to come from the east. De Ciagula and the staff looked at each other. They had subconsciously thought that the transport ships were slow, but they forgot that the French-Turkish trade had already used steam paddle steamers. It would take less than a week for this thing to travel from Piraeus to Genoa. The staff officer nodded, then shook his head, but the cargo capacity of a steam paddle steamer is relatively small, and there is no advanced preparation of supplies. This Demville took 2 steps back nervously and whispered, I really didn't think about this. I'm really sorry. Just treat it as nonsense. Wait. De Ciagula raised his hand to signal the staff officer. There is no other way at the moment. Send someone to Piraeus. I remember that Baron Memuk is running a trading company there. Ask him to think of a solution. The port of Marseille could not transport goods. Corsica could not raise enough supplies in a short time, and the main force of the British Mediterranean fleet was near the port of Bizerte in Tunisia, so the direction of Greece was the only hope. A few days later, the Cape Parrot appeared outside the port of Piraeus. That afternoon, in a room on the second floor of the Port Management Committee building, the general manager of the French East Mediterranean Trading Company, Stella, also known as the newly crowned Baron Memak, looked at the ship owners in the room and said earnestly, "This is basically the situation. The Genoese troops need a total of 4 million pounds of flour, 35,000 barrels of wine, 50,000 pounds of gunpowder, as well as a large number of artillery shells, medicines and other supplies. I hope everyone can undertake the transportation task, and the remuneration will surely satisfy everyone." Unfortunately, the East Mediterranean Trading Company's own ships were basically not in the port at this time, and the fastest batch would not return for 5 days, so Stella had to find French private ship owners and planned to hire their steam paddle steamers. Several people immediately shook their heads and stood up, preparing to leave. "Baron Memak, everyone knows that the British fleet is cruising near Genoa, which is too dangerous. Yes, if there is no risk, why not ship supplies from Marseille? And they want us to advance part of the payment, which is definitely not a good deal. Most of the funds of the East Mediterranean Trading Company are in Syria and Egypt. After all, those are the main purchasing points, and Styler does not even have enough money to buy the materials needed by Dimabin. If he can wait another half a month, no, even 10 days, Styler can easily solve these problems, but right now, what he lacks most is time. Please wait a moment." Styler hurriedly stopped several people and said, "I can ensure that you will not encounter the British fleet. As for the cost, the East Mediterranean Trading Company can pay you 25% interest." "Excuse me, Baron Memak, I'm afraid I can't take this business. Who knows where the British warships will pop up? To be honest, the risk is really too great." Seeing that several people insisted on leaving, Styler was sweating profusely and shouted loudly, "30% interest, plus insurance please, for God's sake." However, several people wanted to get up and leave. Although these ship owners are all French, they are more businessmen. When the ratio of income to risk is too low, they will not care about patriotism, let alone loyalty to the king. Just as the door was opened and the ship owners stepped out, a man in his 30s with rough skin and wearing a black coarse cloth coat, who had been sitting in the corner, stood up and said loudly, "Baron Memak, I can lend you my boat and advance you money to fill a ship with flour." Immediately, a ship owner who was familiar with him pulled him hard and whispered, "Leon, are you crazy? If you encounter a British warship, you will be ruined." "Thank you, Ferry, but I have made up my mind." Leon Trock looked at the people who walked to the door again. "You may know that my family has been engaged in shipping business between France and the Far East since my great-grandfather's generation. In the most glorious period of my grandfather, the family owned 4 ships, among which the Ocean Current was a 3-masted sailing ship with a length of 43 yards. Ferry nodded silently at the side, confirming his statement. The ship owners stopped and turned to look at Trock. A merchant with 4 ships is definitely a wealthy family. Trock sighed and continued. "Later, France lost to the British in the 7 Years' War. Well, as everyone knows, we lost all our Far East trade. The Ocean Current was also seized by the British at the Cape of Good Hope. 2 years later, my family's business went bankrupt. After that, my father went to Naples to help people revise nautical charts to support his family, but he soon fell ill and died. My mother took my brother and me to Marseille to mend fishing nets for a living. When she was 30 years old, her fingers were all rotten. My brother and I both had malaria, had no money to buy medicine, and almost died. Fortunately, I was lucky. With the help of a friend of my father, I continued my shipping business and finally bought a ship." Someone said impatiently, "Sorry, but what do you want to say?" Trock raised his hand and gestured. "Most of the gentlemen here make a living from the Mediterranean trade. Then have you ever thought about what would happen if our army in Genoa was defeated by the Austrians?" The ship owners looked at each other in surprise. Trock said solemnly, "What my father experienced will happen to me and you. And our children may not be able to afford medicine and are on the verge of death. How can it be as serious as you say?" "No, I'm not exaggerating at all," Trock said. "After the Genoese army is annihilated, there will be no defense in southern France. By then, the Austrian army will occupy the port of Marseille and cut off France's Mediterranean outlet. North Africa will lose contact with its homeland and will soon surrender to Britain. He looked at the ship owners with a burning gaze. By then, the Mediterranean trade will be completely monopolized by British merchant ships. You, me, and everyone here will go bankrupt. There is only this one chance. Believe me, we must defend Genoa. Not for the king, nor for Baron Memak, but only for ourselves, so that we will no longer be bullied by the British. He held out his hand. Who wants to go to Genoa with me? Send supplies to the French soldiers there, and let them teach those Austrian bastards a lesson. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 796, A Critical Moment. In fact, Trock had exaggerated the situation. After all, Napoleon had already occupied Milan and was setting up the Po River defense line to cut off the connection between Melis and the Austrian mainland. In terms of overall strategy, France still took the initiative. But these things were not known to the ship owners far away in Greece. In their view, the French-Italian front was indeed in danger. The room was silent for a few seconds, and then a middle-aged man with a big beard sitting by the window stood up, straightened his clothes, and said, "Mr. Trock is right. I still have to continue doing business in the Mediterranean, so I have to do something." He looked at Styler. "Baron Memak, if you are willing to pay 40% interest, I don't mind sending a ship to Genoa." Styler seemed to struggle for a while, and then nodded and said, "Okay, Mr. Borrow, 40%. Thank you for your help." He used some business skills to make it seem that the interest was so high that it made him feel distressed. In fact, he had just decided to use the shares of the East Mediterranean Trading Company in his hand as a bargaining chip to exchange the ships of these ship owners. He believed that His Royal Highness the Crown Prince would allow him to do so. Because compared to the victory or defeat of the war, money is always secondary. Whether the money is spent on logistics or weapons, it is much better to spend it on paying war reparations. Then, someone else said loudly, "Count me in. The account of the British seizing my goods in North America 8 years ago should be settled this time." Ferry looked at his old friend, sighed, and raised his right hand, Sinsley, and said, "So, okay, my ship will go too." In fact, he was also moved by the high interest rate of 40%. The materials on the ship were purchased by himself, and there was actually a lot of profit in it, plus the high interest. This trip is equivalent to half a year's profit. Among the ship owners who walked to the door, some still left with disdain, but about half of them turned back. Trock's words did make them feel a sense of crisis. Before dark, Stella had collected 8 steam paddle steamers, as well as 3 million pounds of food and some gunpowder. He excitedly thanked Trock and other ship owners, and promised that after the matter in Genoa was resolved, he would apply to His Royal Highness the Crown Prince for a 1-year tax reduction for them. Although the carrying capacity of steam paddle steamers is not as good as that of large supply ships, 8 ships are enough to transport 3 weeks of supplies for the Dimabin Corps. The next day, with Stella's gold coins paving the way, most of the porters in Piraeus port were busy around Trock and others' ships. Before 3 o'clock in the afternoon, 8 fully loaded steam paddle steamers, led by the frigate Cape Parrot, sailed west with long black smoke. North of Genoa, the town of Novi Ligure, OSA joined forces headquarters. Melis stared at the map in front of him, with veins on his forehead. After several minutes, he slammed his cane on the ground and gritted his teeth, saying, "The Savoni Legion will recapture Pavia, and we must stay here and continue the attack. Genoa spies have found out that Dimabin's food can only last for 2 or 3 days at most. We have never been so close to victory, and we should never give up at this time." 10 days ago, when the news of Napoleon's sudden capture of Milan reached here, all the Austrian officers were shocked. But after learning that Napoleon only had more than 12,000 soldiers, Melis determined that the latter was not to be feared, so he ordered to insist on attacking Genoa, and only sent Cervoni to defend the ferry in Pavia. Logically speaking, his strategy was correct. Milan had been lost anyway, and if he rushed back at this time, the French army in Genoa would probably have a breath of relief, and he would face a situation where he had been busy on the Italian battlefield for a whole day, but had not gained any results. And the fall of Milan was naturally the responsibility of Bolu. Melas destroyed the Dauphin corps here and occupied Genoa, which was a meritorious service. After taking Genoa, his 50,000 troops marched north and could easily recapture Milan. However, this morning Cervoni sent someone to report that he encountered an ambush by Napoleon near Pavia. Fortunately, he reacted quickly, so the loss was not great, but the army was blocked on the south bank of the Po River. At the same time, the emperor's instructions concerning the situation in Italy were also sent to Melas's headquarters. It was obvious that His Majesty was extremely dissatisfied with the loss of Milan. Several officers standing in front of Melas looked at each other, and then Argento took a cautious step forward and suggested, "General, perhaps we should transfer more troops to Pavia, in case the ferry fails." "No need to remind me." Melas seemed to be overwhelmed by the pressure, and suddenly roared, "The ferry must be kept open. Capture Genoa, then return to Milan. Everything will be fine." Genoa. Dauphin rubbed his forehead anxiously and asked the quartermaster in a tired voice, "Only half a day's rations are left." "Yes," General Augereau on the side shouted. "General, as long as we concentrate our forces, the possibility of breaking through from the direction of La Spezia is still very high. La Spezia is on the east side of Genoa. The Argentore Corps there is the weakest in the Austro-Salian coalition, with less than 8,000 people. And Genoa still has 25,000 French troops, and there is a chance to defeat it." Dauphin waved his hands sadly. "Alas, that will only get further and further away from France, and the Austrians will follow immediately. And we can't be sure how much food there is in La Spezia." Serraria said anxiously, "But if we go on like this, we won't even last until tomorrow." Dauphin sighed and looked at the front line, where artillery fire was flying. "We have done everything we can. If we have no choice but to surrender, His Majesty the King and God will forgive us." The officers in the headquarters all lowered their heads. At this moment, Junot's frantic shouting came from outside the house. The sound was so loud that it even overwhelmed the rumbling of cannons. "Ship. The ship is coming. It's our ship." Dauphin stood up suddenly, rushed out of the office with unprecedented agility, looked at Junot and shouted, "What ship? Did you see it clearly? How many are there? I saw it with my own eyes, I swear. There are a total of 7 ships. No, it seems to be 8, all steamships, and they have entered the port." The latter was so excited that his tone changed. "Governor Ibiazo has sent people to unload the cargo." Dauphin felt a huge sense of happiness surging over his head, and immediately made a cross on his chest devoutly. "Thank Almighty God. Thank you for not forgetting us." Yes. Trock and his party drove at full speed throughout the journey, and insisted on sailing, as long as they could barely see the sea surface. With their efforts, it took less than 6 days to transport the supplies to the port of Genoa. Chapter 797 Defense, Attack. Of course, this is also because the steamship itself has an excellent speed. If it were an ordinary sailing ship, it would take at least 10 days to complete this journey, and Dauphin could only surrender with hatred. To be honest, Joseph originally set up the East Mediterranean Trade Company just to promote French-Turkish trade and win over the Ottomans, but he did not expect to reap the bonus of high-speed logistical support. At the port, the excited French soldiers threw Captain Trock and other captains into the air and kept shouting their names. At that moment, several captains suddenly felt that even without high interest, this adventure was worth it. As a large amount of flour was moved into the warehouse, Dauphin felt his back hardened. At this time, there were still 22 days left before His Royal Highness the Crown Prince gave him the task of defending Genoa for 2 months. These ships of supplies were enough for him to hold on until then. At noon the next day, he even agreed to Augereau's request for a counterattack on the eastern front. The soldiers who had eaten their fill were indeed in high spirits, and in half a day they pushed the encirclement of Argentore back a full kilometer. Some are happy, some are sad. The Austrian army soon received the news sent by the spies in Genoa, and the entire command center was in mourning. Melis's face was as hen, and he kept muttering, "The navy's trash, idiots." After a long time, Argented glanced at the commander-in-chief and said cautiously, "General, given the current situation, we should consider giving up Genoa." "Give up?" Melis raised his head, and then suddenly laughed. "Yes, of course, but now it's not as simple as giving up Genoa." Argented frowned, but immediately understood. As Napoleon continued to consolidate his control over the Lombardy region, he would soon completely lose contact with Austria. By then, it would no longer be his own army besieging Genoa, but it would become a pincer attack from Napoleon and Imogen from the north and south. Cold sweat immediately seeped out of his forehead. You know, France can continue to send troops to Italy from the Taulan direction in the future, and it is only a matter of time before the Austrian-Saharan coalition is defeated. He looked at Melis and said, "General, we should move eastward immediately, bypass Parma and return to the Mantua fortress." "Absolutely not." Carly immediately retorted loudly, "You are letting Sardinia face the French army alone. We will lose the trust of all our allies. Sardinia is in the westernmost part of Italy. After the Austrian army retreats eastward, the French army can occupy Alessandria at any time, and cut off the connection between Austria and Sardinia." Melis sighed heavily and nodded. "You are right. We must keep Sardinia, otherwise the situation in the whole of Italy will collapse quickly." What he didn't say was that Parma, as a neutral country, would probably not allow his army to cross the border. Of course, he could force his way through, and the army of Parma was simply unable to stop it, but this would undoubtedly push it towards France and affect the attitudes of other neutral countries in Italy. Melis stood up and walked to the map. He pondered for a long time, before pointing his cane at Alessandria, and said in a deep voice, "Order the entire army to gather in Alessandria and set up a defense line there. I will ask His Majesty the Emperor to send reinforcement to attack Milan from Mantua." Then, he knocked on Pavia again, "and we will recapture Pavia, cross the Po River, and cooperate to attack Milan. Alessandria is the transportation hub of northern Italy. Starting from here, we can support Sardinia to the west, go north to Milan, and at the same time deter Genoa. By stationing troops here, we have the basis to continue to compete with France for northern Italy." Milan. Napoleon also pointed to the map on the wall and said to Victor and other officers, "The Austrians now have two choices. One is to withdraw from Parma to Mantua and confront our army there. In this case, we can only focus our attack on Turin. The second is to retreat to Alexandria and prepare to gather strength to cross the river and counterattack Milan. But they have to reserve troops to guard against the attack launched by General Imogen from the south, so Vienna can only send reinforcement." Marmont muttered, "I hope they won't flee back to Mantua. I have seen that fortress. It is not easy to break it." Napoleon nodded. "I guess Melis will most likely choose to go to Alexandria. After all, he wants to show their emperor that he has not been driven out of Piedmont by us." He looked at the herald on the side, sent someone to contact General Imogen, and ask him to monitor the north of Genoa at any time. If the Austrian army shows signs of retreating to the east, try to delay them. I will launch an attack from Lodi. "Yes, Commander." Napoleon said to Victor again, "You will gather the troops immediately and prepare to cross the river from Pavia." Ah. The latter was stunned for a moment. Cross the river? According to his understanding, the defense along the Po River should be done to prevent the Austrian army from attacking Milan. After all, the Austrian-Sarko coalition still has a military advantage. Napoleon smiled. "We have to defeat Melis before the reinforcement from Vienna arrive, otherwise we will have to face enemies from Mantua and Alessandria." "But our troops," Napoleon said confidently, "Melis' army failed to capture Genoa, and its morale must be very low at this time. It is the best time for us to attack. In addition, Alexandria is a very good offensive base, but it is not suitable for defense. General Imogen can even cross the Alps and attack from his west. So, the troops are not a problem. Southern Netherlands, north of Brussels." Joseph looked at the battle plan that Napoleon sent through the chat signal machine, which was also a report for merit, and smiled with satisfaction. "Colonel Buvanaba did not disappoint me. He used such an army to force the Austro-Saharan coalition into a dead end." Emin whispered on the side, "It's Colonel Bonaparte, Your Highness. Mr. Buvanaba has changed his last name." "Well, Bonaparte." Joseph nodded. Napoleon Bonaparte. This name sounds much more pleasant. He signed Napoleon's battle plan and gave it to Emin to send back to Italy. According to this trend, northern Italy will soon be pacified by Napoleon, which is almost exactly the same as the historical trend. Thinking of this, he suddenly narrowed his eyes. He seemed to be a little too lazy in the war situation in Italy and left it completely to Napoleon to deal with. In fact, the current situation there is much better than in history. At the very least, Dauphin did not lose Genoa, and France has a solid stronghold on the southern coast of northern Italy. If we only rely on Napoleon to fight hard, wouldn't it be a waste of the strategic advantage there? He thought for a moment and said to Emin, please notify Mr. Jane Talleyrand and let him go to Turin with the Count of Provence. Chapter 798. Decisive Battle in Brussels. 20 minutes later, Emin looked at the 3-page order in his hand and sighed in his heart. I'm afraid that hundreds of signalmen will not have time to eat dinner today. He was about to turn around and go out, but Joseph suddenly remembered that Napoleon's report mentioned that the Milan Parliament voluntarily donated 2 million francs and some valuable works of art to his army. Voluntary donation? Joseph shook his head. He knew too well Napoleon's nature in the occupied areas. Although it was customary to rob occupied areas in this era, few people did it as exaggerated as Napoleon. Wherever he set foot, there was resentment from the heavens and the people. The 2 million francs were probably donated by him using cannons to persuade the Milanese, especially those famous paintings, who would have nothing to do and donate these things to the army. Joseph didn't want the international situation of France being surrounded by enemies during the Napoleon era to reappear. He even sent a Doric to keep an eye on him, but he didn't expect that Napoleon's talent for offending people was unstoppable. Those who deserve rewards should be rewarded, and those who deserve punishment must be punished. Joseph wrote a commendation to Napoleon and a secret document, and handed them to Emmanuel. Please give these to the Duke of Broglie, and ask him to send the gendarmes to Italy to investigate. I have written very clearly what to do. Yes, Your Highness. Emmanuel left, and soon Lefebvre knocked on the door and saluted Joseph, saying, Your Highness, the American volunteers have just arrived in the town of Uccle, with more than 1,300 people. They are finally here. Joseph smiled and stood up and said, please make arrangements. I will go to greet them in person. Lefebvre was a little surprised. Your Highness, with all due respect, these Americans do not have much combat effectiveness. You don't seem to need to take them so seriously. Joseph smiled and patted his arm. No, they are like a rope that can drag the entire United States. It should be said that this American army came at the right time, and there were British people right in front of them to fight. Half a month ago, the French army had just cleared the area around Brussels, and the Duke of York led 20,000 British troops to Antwerp. On the other hand, Franz II also transferred the Clefort Corps from Gelden, plus a Prussian army, totaling more than 35,000 people, to join the remnants of Prince Coburg in Leuven. At this time, not counting the Dutch army, the anti-French alliance had already assembled 63,000 troops around Brussels. On Joseph's side, there were only 22,000 French regular troops, 13,000 newly joined Walloon Defence forces, and less than 5,000 surrendered troops in the Flemish region. A total of 40,000 troops. However, there are a large number of newly recruited Walloon recruits, and the Flemish corps is even less expected, so there are only about 30,000 people who can really fight. Today, there are still 14,000 Dutch troops in Brussels, but their training level is very poor, and many of them have cooperated with the French army in the battle to overthrow William V, so the overall fighting will is relatively weak. Joseph left 7,000 Walloon Defence forces to continue the siege of Brussels, and he led the main force to the south of Antwerp to confront the Anglo-Austrian-Prussian coalition forces. Antwerp, Mechelen. On the high ground behind the coalition forces, Count Clefort observed the French positions in the distance through a telescope and shouted, "Now is obviously a good opportunity to launch an attack. The French are not prepared for defense at all. I only saw a small number of stragglers wandering around their defense line. General Davidovich has asked for help many times. We must try our best to break through the French defense line, otherwise he may at any time." The Duke of York glanced at him and said calmly, "If you hadn't been fighting with thousands of Walloon troops for 5 or 6 days, we would have started the attack long ago." Clifford paused and looked up at the sky awkwardly. When he came from the direction of Leuven, he was ambushed by the Walloon police. These Walloons were so fierce that he had to temporarily retreat to Leuven and wait for the Prussian army to set out together before repelling the opponent. The Duke of York also raised the telescope. "My cavalry reconnaissance found that there are at least 30,000 French troops here. I must find out where they are deployed." He was speaking when he suddenly stopped and then said in a hurried tone, "Damn, who is that?" He turned his head and gestured to an officer not far away. "Lieutenant Colonel Swenson, I remember you fought in North America?" "Yes, Your Highness. I only returned to the country in 1783, and I have been there before." The Duke of York immediately pointed to the French position in the distance. "Look at those military flags. I think they are Americans." Swenson only glanced through the telescope and frowned. "The 12th Infantry Regiment of the Continental Army and the Maryland skirmishers are indeed Americans, Your Highness. I have fought with them." Soon, the thousands of American soldiers came to the British position under the cover of the French cavalry, lined up to provoke, and all kinds of English curses could be vaguely heard. At this moment, a British cavalry officer came to the side of the Duke of York, pulled the reins, raised his hat and saluted, saying, "Your Highness, I have repeatedly confirmed that there is no trace of the enemy within 8 miles around." The Duke of York looked at the ragged Americans in the distance and said grimly, "Send the order to prepare for a frontal attack." Although he didn't know what the French were planning, as long as there was no ambush around, he could use his superior forces to crush the enemy in one fell swoop. The offensive plan had been prepared long ago. Only a dozen minutes later, the 2 British infantry brigades in front took the lead. More than 60 cannon slowly moved forward with the infantry lines. In order to carry these heavy equipment, the British Army's marching speed slowed down a lot, but now these cannons will bring them a huge advantage. At the same time, the Prussian corps outflanked the French flank from the right wing. With their huge advantage in manpower, they can stretch the front longer, to a distance that the French army cannot take care of, and then they can turn inward and form a semi-encirclement with the British army in front. The French army's defensive position is located on a high ground, which is somewhat disadvantageous to the attacker, but the Duke of York is confident that he can make up for this disadvantage with his superior manpower. Moreover, the situation in Brussels is critical, so he can only launch a strong attack as soon as possible. The American volunteers who were still arrogant just now only had a slight contact with the British army and immediately retreated to their own high ground. They were used for mental attacks, and Joseph was not prepared to let them fight any hard battles. The British infantry brigade's advancement speed was not very fast. They were waiting for the Prussian army on the side to outflanking, and then launch an attack at the same time. Half an hour later, the French artillery roared first. The shells flew from 1.3 kilometers away, with a piercing scream, and accurately hit the British infantry line. In an instant, blood and flesh flew everywhere, broken limbs fell everywhere, and screams came one after another. The Duke of York didn't know that on the opposite high ground was the French Royal 1st Artillery Battalion, the best artillery in Europe. Chapter 799, The Battle of Brussels 2nd. The lieutenants of the Royal Artillery Battalion studied university mathematics courses in the military academy. If they don't have the ability to calculate the trajectory in half a minute, they can forget about getting their diplomas. The artillery carried out live fire training at all costs, and 1 month's practice was equivalent to 1 year's practice for the British Army. The extra cost was exchanged for a superhuman shooting level. Before, the French army's battle in the southern Netherlands was too smooth, and the artillery had almost no room to play, and they won. Now, there is finally a chance to show their strength. Generally speaking, even a 12-pound cannon has to start shooting within 800 steps, which is more than 400 meters, in order to ensure the killing effect. But this time it is a defensive battle, and the Royal Artillery Battalion can calmly choose the position and measure the shooting parameters in advance, which is even simpler than the military academy examination content. This led to them being able to maintain a very high hit rate when firing at the extreme range of 1.3 kilometers. The artillery positions are all located on high ground, and this range is not exaggerated. Howitzers can even fire up to 1.8 kilometers away, but at such a long distance, and with indirect fire, there is almost no practical significance. After being bombarded, the British officers even thought they were ambushed, and hurriedly ordered the infantry line to stop advancing, sent skirmishers to search nearby, and only began to attack after confirming that the shells were fired from the French positions. With their delay, the Prussians who were flanking were left out. The French artillery immediately turned the muzzle, allowing the Prussian army to enjoy a precise and intensive bombardment. The Prussian army was suddenly in a state of confusion, and the commander had to order a retreat. In this way, the first day of the coalition's attack ended hastily. They didn't even see the French soldiers, and nearly 400 people were taken away by the artillery. The next day, the Duke of York adjusted his tactics and ordered his own artillery to go up first, using the advantage of numbers to suppress the French army. He had confirmed yesterday that the French army had only 37 guns, a small half of his own. However, the level of the British artillery was already inferior, and the artillery shells could not reach the edge of the French artillery position. They had to take the risk of approaching until they were about 900 steps away from the French army, and finally a shell barely landed near the opposite cannon. But in the process of advancing, they had already become the focus of the French artillery. After several rounds of accurate volleys, the British artillery had suffered heavy casualties and had to retreat in embarrassment, leaving 4 guns behind. However, they did not gain nothing. The tactics of attracting firepower objectively covered the infantry. The British infantry line came all the way to the bottom of the slope, and the French artillery was pointed at them again. The Duke of York decided to seize this opportunity and sent his confidant General Harris to supervise the battle in person on the front line, asking him to seize the high ground occupied by the French before dark. More than 12,000 British infantry, with the cooperation of 3,000 Austrian skirmishers, approached the French defense line at the top of the slope step by step under the continuous flying shells. The Prussian infantry brigade on the right wing also rushed up quickly. They were 1.2 kilometers away from the British troops in the middle, which was definitely beyond the coverage of the French defense line. As long as the British could delay the French army for 20 minutes, they could complete the flanking. Soon, gunshots began to be heard in the middle of the battlefield. This indicated that the infantry on both sides of Britain and France had begun to exchange fire. To be honest, the discipline of the Duke of York's red shirts was really good. They were able to maintain their integrity despite being bombarded by artillery, and they advanced more than 800 steps and successfully entered the distance of infantry combat. The French line array on the opposite side did not seem to be dense, which greatly boosted Harris's confidence. He kept urging the troops in the back row to press forward while looking to the west. But soon, the French Royal Infantry Division used percussion cap guns to teach the British what the weapon generation gap was. The loading speed and projectile power were much higher than the British flintlock rifles, and the British soldiers kept falling one after another, and corpses were rolling down the slope at any time. On the French side, once a soldier was injured, he would retreat to the back of the slope, and someone would immediately come up from there. The British soldiers felt that there seemed to be countless enemies hiding on the back of the invisible slope. Finally, the severe casualties made the extremely resilient red shirts unable to bear it. Harris had used up his reserve troops, and the entire infantry line kept retreating under his scolding, and was about to collapse. At this moment, the sound of trumpets came from the west. Harris was immediately excited. The Prussians arrived at the designated position, and that was the sound of their attack. He immediately waved his sword and shouted, "Hold on a little longer. General Karl Kreut will soon defeat the French left wing." 1.2 kilometers away, Count Karl Kreut's vanguard had approached the top of the slope. Major Georg, who was commanding the vanguard, pointed to the top of the slope excitedly and shouted, "Occupy there. Then turn to the east immediately. We have exceeded the French defense line." Before he finished speaking, he heard the sound of military drums on the slope, and then a flag with a dolphin and a golden iris appeared in his field of vision. Georg was stunned. How could this be possible? More than 16,000 soldiers were deployed in the middle, plus 6,000 soldiers on his side, a total of 22,000 people, barely pulling out a 1.2 kilometer long battle line. Even with so many people, The gap between the center and the right wing was already dangerous, so he had to be on guard at any time against the French cavalry cutting him from the junction and cutting himself and Harris's troops into two sections. Both sides also deployed a large number of defensive forces on the left wing. Excluding cavalry, artillery and reserve troops, the French could not deploy more than 15,000 troops on the front. But they were able to maintain a battle line of 1.2 kilometers. How could this be possible? However, the dense gunfire from the top of the slope told him that all this was true. Georg pulled the reins hard and ordered them to line up on the spot, ready to fight the enemy in a line formation. But the Prussian army had to run up the hill quickly before. At this time, some people stopped according to the order, but more than 1/3 of the soldiers were still walking up, and the whole queue suddenly became a mess. Opposite them, the French infantry line began to fire in an orderly manner. Dense bullets flew into the Prussian crowd. Amid the blood and screams, the already messy formation became even more chaotic. Count Karol Krutt in the distance was shocked and was about to order the reserve army to press forward, but he saw that the Georg regiment in front had already fled like a frightened flock of sheep. He looked up the slope with a telescope in confusion and saw that there were only two sparse rows of infantry on the French defense line, and the distance between the soldiers was also very large. He immediately understood that the French used this sparse battle line to cover the 1.2 kilometer wide battlefield. Chapter 800, The Battle of Brussels 3. Joseph used the backslope plus thin red line tactics invented by the Duke of Wellington in history. Oh, now it should be called the thin white line tactics. The French uniforms are white, and the naming rights of this tactic have been given to France. In fact, Joseph's troops deployed on the front were less than 14,000, and the formation was not a regular battle line. At most it could only be called a horizontal formation. A large number of two rows of 100 to 150 meters were arranged at the top of the slope. There was a gap of about 10 meters between different horizontal formations, so a very wide battlefield could be covered with limited troops. Count Karol Krutt of Prussia thought that his attack position had exceeded the end of the French defense line and could form an outflanking on its flank, but in fact, even if his troops extended 100 meters to the west, there would still be a French horizontal formation there. Moreover, according to the requirements of the backslope tactics, there was a skirmisher group on each wing of the horizontal formation to provide cover, and there were cavalry at a farther position. If you want to compete in the length of the battle line, the currently commonly used infantry line plus skirmisher tactics are no match for the thin white line. As for the density of firepower, the Duke of Wellington has done repeated tests. In the case of occupying high ground, 2 rows of horizontal teams are enough, and the width of the battle line is the key. As long as the battle line is wider than the opponent's, a higher density of firepower can be exerted. If Joseph is more radical, he can even let the 2 wings bend inwards at this time to form an outflanking of the Anglo-Prussian-Austrian coalition. Of course, the backslope plus thin white line tactics also have defects, mainly because the quality of the soldiers is very high. The relative positions between the horizontal teams must be kept very accurately. When facing the enemy's artillery and cavalry raids, it is necessary to be able to quickly use the back of the slope for cover and transform into a dense 4-row horizontal team. If the soldiers are not well trained, they will soon disperse their own formation without the enemy attacking. However, at this time, the main force of the French army fighting in Mechlin is the Royal 4th Infantry Division. They have the best training level in Europe. Even though Joseph originally planned to let them practice the tactics of the backslope and thin white line for 3 weeks, they mastered it in less than half a month. In fact, from the beginning, there was no suspense about the outcome of the Mechlin offensive and defensive battle. As the Karol Krutt Corps on the west retreated, the last bit of hope in the hearts of the British troops in the middle completely disappeared. The morale that had been on the verge of collapse by the French army on the high ground was now like a flood. General Harris did not even struggle, but ordered the Austrian skirmishers to cover the rear and let the soldiers run down the slope. At the same time, a drum sounded on the left wing of the French army. Murat galloped over the highest point of the slope, drew out his saber, waved it forward majestically, and shouted, "In the name of the Crown Prince, follow me." Behind him, 3 companies of hussars lined up in neat rows, shouting and rushing towards the chaotic British infantry. Murat's face still had the sallow color of a recent illness. He had suffered from severe dysentery before and had just recovered and returned to the team last week, but his spirit was extremely excited and he swung his saber back and forth, bringing up a puff of blood every time. Because the Duke of York stretched the offensive front very wide, the Austrian skirmishers could only cover the area of several hundred meters to the west at this time. Murat's cavalry came and went freely on both sides of them, wantonly harvesting the lives of British soldiers. In this way, less than 500 hussars drove tens of thousands of British infantry to run to kilometers away. It was not until the British cavalry came to support that Murat retreated to the high ground under Lefebvre's order. After all, the main task of the French army this time was to hold on, and it was not advisable to pursue too deep. But in less than 20 minutes, there were already thousands of British infantrymen who were hacked to death by the French cavalry and trampled to death by each other. The Duke of York was an excellent commander. He immediately mobilized Count Clerfayt's Austrian corps to organize a defense line below the high ground and pressed his own guards up, which saved most of the defeated soldiers. After the coalition rested for 2 days, the Duke of York regrouped his troops and launched an attack on the French positions again. It was not that he did not want to bypass the French defense line. In fact, the terrain of the southern Netherlands is flat, and Brussels can be reached from Ghent or Diest. But Brussels could be broken by the French at any time, which made him dare not take a detour and waste time, and he could only fight a decisive battle on the battlefield selected by Joseph. This time, the Duke of York adjusted his tactics and concentrated all the cavalry to attack the French artillery positions. His own artillery took the opportunity to occupy a bulge on the east side of the slope and bombarded the French defense line there. At the same time, the British and Austrian infantry attacked the top of the slope under the cover of artillery. As for the Prussians, their morale has been low since the defeat 3 days ago. They do not have the indomitable spirit of the Prussian army in the era of Frederick the Great, so the Duke of York can only let them take charge of auxiliary tasks such as covering the 2 wings. With the sound of low trumpets, more than 2,400 British and Austrian cavalry rushed up to the French artillery position from the east side of the slope. The French artillery responded immediately, and shells kept hitting the coalition cavalry ranks accurately, tearing people and horses to pieces. But under the strict order of the Duke of York, these cavalry could only continue to charge despite the terrifying artillery bombardment. Soon, the British cavalry commander vaguely saw the thin white infantry ranks in front, and suddenly he was excited. It was exactly the same as what General Harris said, that was just 2 rows of loose horizontal columns, and it was impossible to stop him. As long as they easily passed through the defense line of those infantry, the French artillery not far away would be lambs for them to slaughter. But at this moment, the rhythm of the drums in the French position suddenly changed, and several horizontal teams in front of the artillery quickly changed their formations and gathered into a thick 4-row linear array. The soldiers in the first 2 rows pointed their bayonets diagonally forward, while the soldiers in the back 2 rows aimed their guns. The whole process of changing the formation took only 2 or 3 minutes. Facing such a hedgehog formation, the coalition cavalry had to bypass it to both sides. But on both sides of this infantry line, there were 2 infantry horizontal teams responsible for cover, forming a flat U shape as a whole. In fact, this is a variant of the hollow square formation. Since the Paris Police Academy, the hollow square formation has been one of the standard courses for infantry, and it is very handy to use. Because the coalition cavalry has been climbing the slope, the speed is already very slow when approaching the French defense line, so there is no need to use a hollow square formation, and this variant that saves manpower is enough to resist. Sure enough, the coalition cavalry bypassed the 2 sides of the defense line, and after eating several rounds of artillery shells, it has shown signs of fatigue. Just as the commander of the Union cavalry wanted to regroup his troops and try to attack again, thousands of American soldiers wearing gray-blue uniforms and flying the stars and stripes suddenly appeared on the east side of the slope. These Americans were in a scattered formation and did not shoot, but just kept shouting and cursing at the Union cavalry. End of this chapter. Thank you very much for reaching the end. Don't forget to like. Looking for more exclusive content and immediate access? Subscribe to our Patreon. Remember, every like, subscription, or donation encourages us to continue. Thanks to everyone. See you in the next video.